Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan,
And I'm Albert.
and today we return to our series Humanity of Prologue. Here we finally hit episode 11, Global Harvests. But before we jump into that, Albert, how are things on your end?
well, same as usual, really. Same as the past few weeks. Still very busy. I'm feeling a little tired, but overall, I'm holding up well, and staying healthy and everything. So, yeah, that not much is good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Same old as usual. Been working on the show and whatnot. But I had a nice, pleasant experience earlier this week.
Mm.
Because I finally got to watch Invincible, which is
Mm.
an Amazon series, superhero series. No, I don't usually jump up and down about superhero stuff. I watch the Marvel films
Yeah.
and I like those quite a bit, but probably more for the characters than the source material.
Right. Right.
But of course that meme has been going around the past few days that I just couldn't help but notice it of of the two main characters in the fight.
right.
Um, eh, oh my God, some of them have been just perfect. I love the one with the Bone Wars Martian coat. Hit on the tail.
oh, right. Right. Yeah.
And then the Magic School Bus one, of course, just floored me. Come on, Arnold. A regular field trip with the frizz. Think.
oh my goodness. I don't think I saw that one, but yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, so I was like, you know what? I should probably give this a watch since I've been seeing that, and then a lot of people saying like, "Oh, it's good." Of course, Double Toasted had
Mhm.
nothing but nice things to say. So I'm
Mhm.
like, yeah, let me watch the first episode. Um, and yeah, I mean, I was already hooked. I mean, the characters just I fell in love with all the characters. Like it's so rare when I watch a new show and like every character that they introduce and like who they are and like what their story is like just grabs at you, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
That's only happened a couple times in the past few years with like
Yeah.
shows that I've watched. So immediately that got my attention. Then of course the last 3 minutes hit and I was like, oh, it's that kind of show. Oh my God, the the sheer brutality of that scene. I don't want to spoil anything,
Mhm.
but let's just say, like, for me, it was like, made Primal look like dinosaur trains.
wow.
But yeah, no, I spent the last couple days binging through it. There's only 8 episodes, but I can tell like it's been very popular, and
Mhm.
I just fell in love with the whole thing. And since they greenlit seasons 2 and 3 already, I know I got a lot of new episodes in store to look forward
right.
to. So that's really been kind of the highlight of the past week for me. Um, yeah, it's kind of off topic from what we usually talk about, but yeah, I definitely recommend it if you like a fun superhero story that has like good. It's got a good heart. The violent stuff is very few,
Mhm.
and it's not like a cynical kind of show,
Right.
and that I think made me appreciate it a lot more.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's kind of been what I've been up to.
Great.
But yeah, so this is Global Harvests. So we're going to be talking a lot about agriculture and pastoralism. And this is important because up to this point in our series, the history of the human species has been one of forager societies. At various points, living somewhere between nomadism and sedentism. It's only within the last 11,700 years of the Holocene epoch that farming emerged on the world stage, and thus a world that many of our viewers will be closely familiar with was in its earliest chapters. So, although roughly 27% of the human population works in agriculture, and so that includes 1% of people in the US and 1% of people in the UK, over 60% of us depend on the products of its labor to sustain our lives. And much of that labor has gone into only 15 domesticated plant species, including wheat, rice, and corn, which provide around 90% of the world's food energy intake. Now, our domesticated livestock brings in no less dramatic numbers. On the order of 65 billion chickens are eaten every year.
Hmm.
And beef consumption averaged over 60.9 metric tons just in 2018 alone. So clearly, our species relies on the fruits of agricultural labor to run the world.
Hmm.
So begs the question, how did we go from a world of hunter gatherers to a world of mostly farmers? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's jump to the next slide now.
All right.
And before we address this, it'll be good to continue our outlining of the different ages of the Holocene epoch, as we started in the last episode. So the Middle Holocene is known as the Northgrippian Age, after a fun abbreviation of the North Greenland Ice Core project,
Hmm.
which was also used to delineate the previous Greenlandian Age. And the time span that we're looking at is between 8.2 and 4.2 thousand years ago. And the former date is marked by a very brief drop in global temperatures, known as the 8.2 kiloyear event. So Lake Agassiz in North America was still undergoing drainage into the North Atlantic Ocean because the Laurentide ice sheet was still there in shrunken form and it was still melting, as big as it was. And as it happens, it messed with the Gulf Stream and so prevented equatorial ocean temps from reaching northwards again. Human societies naturally felt the effects at unequal levels as parts of the world either cooled and or dried. Of course, thankfully, the rhythms of the overall Holocene warming trends had long been in motion, and the fact that the 8.2 kiloyear event only lasted over 150 years showed how much this interglacial cycle of the Earth managed to keep things in check. And the Northgrippian was truly a golden age for human societies as far as the global environment was concerned, because its span generally correlated with a larger climatic event known as the Holocene climatic optimum. So between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, on average, global temperatures were warm and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere reached a comfortable 280 parts per million. Environments around the world became lusher and wetter and supported biodiverse communities. The kinds of conditions that gave rise to agriculture and
Hmm.
helped boost the human population to about 72 million by 4,000 years ago. Now, much of this climatic optimum was reflected in Africa's humid period. And for many thousands of years, the Sahara was still a grand oasis of rivers, lakes, and wetlands. But all that would change because once the Holocene climatic optimum ended 5,000 years ago, so did the humid period. And the Sahara Desert came to earn its name through immense desertification. The fertile lands dried up, and human communities were pushed in all directions towards these still vegetated lands. And it's in these parts of the world that soon afterwards people began domesticating crops and taking up agriculture. In the east, along the Nile River Valley, this change was very abrupt. The ancient Egyptian and Kushite cultures had already been in their incipient stages during the humid period, with the former bringing forth its earliest writing at 5.3 thousand years ago. But by its end, the world's first state emerged in Egypt under the pharaoh Narmer. As in Africa, Southwest Asia had its own humid period during the optimum. Arabia was green, and the Fertile Crescent was just that. Agriculture had long emerged here at the start of the Holocene, following the demise of the Natufian culture and its neighbors. So by the time the Northgrippian Age began, settlements had grown so large that they became proper cities. By 6,000 years ago, the humidity had dried up the Arabian Peninsula and left it to be populated by mostly pastoral nomads. At the same time, Europe was now mostly under the guidance of farming societies brought in from Anatolia 2.7 thousand years prior. In the east, agriculture, was also underway since the start of the Holocene, having radiated from the Hwanghae and Yangtze rivers into parts of the Tibetan Plateau, Korea, and Southeast Asia. In South Asia, by contrast, agriculture showed up at its western doorstep from the Zagros and was widespread by 5,000 years ago, during which the Indus Valley cities had developed. Siberia, by contrast, was still widely populated by foragers, who mostly consisted of the Tungusic speaking Neo Siberians, though it wouldn't be long before pastoralist groups began to spread their influences across Central Asia. In Australasia, now separate land masses, cultural changes coincided with environmental shifts. Intensive agriculture in New Guinea was now widespread and even began to export some of its staple crops to Southeast Asia. Aboriginal Australians, far from simple nomadic foragers, made their own dramatic changes to the landscape, as we'll see later in this episode. And for the Americas, agriculture had its own story, or should I say stories. In
Mm.
at least four locations did the practice emerge independently: the Andes, the Amazon, Mesoamerica, and Eastern North America. Life for Amerindian nations was changed forever, especially since it was during the Northgrippian that the aforementioned expansions to the Caribbean and the Arctic took place. So, with that little discussion, Albert, do you have anything to add about the Middle Holocene?
Oh, not really. Clearly, a lot happened during this time. Um, I didn't actually realize that the name of the Northgrippian came from an abbreviation of the North Greenland ice core project. That's pretty funny.
Right, right. That was kind of a new surprise to me too. I'm thinking like, oh, this is some site somewhere
Right.
in Greenland, but like, nope. So geologists are clever folks,
Mhm.
as I'm sure you've all noticed as you've been watching our series.
Indeed.
So let's jump to the next slide, and we'll go back to our main question: why did farming begin? Well, if you've been following along closely with this series, you know that foraging societies are not passive actors on the environmental stage. They are not at the mercy of nature, forced to go along with its rhythms against their will. Anthropologists have built up an immense amount of evidence that demonstrates that even as far back as 12,000 years ago, humans have continuously shaped in the habitats in which they live. Prey species and crops that were highly valued were encouraged to survive and grow through land management practices, like the establishment of wild gardens or the use of fire to clear and refertilize hunting and gathering grounds. The steps towards the cultivation of specific crops and the taming of certain game animals would have been very gradual from these earliest practices, and the beginning of agricultural societies, where soils were prepared and harvests were systematically collected and stored, would have been no less a part of this process. There wouldn't have been a moment when a forager went to bed at night and woke up in the morning after an inspirational dream to say, you know what, farming, that's what we're going to do from now on.
Right.
It's not like that at all. By the time that a community was fully invested in agricultural practices, they wouldn't have had a second thought that they weren't strictly hunting and gathering anymore.
Mhm.
It just happened. And if the archaeological record had anything to say about it, it happened in a lot of places at different times. In essence, then, there was no agricultural revolution. As is commonly discussed in the popular literature, the emergence of Neolithic societies, so this is contrasting from the earlier Paleolithic and Mesolithic, was not marked by a single event, but a series of incremental steps with no dividing lines between them. So, okay, that's all well and good, but there's still one important question that needs answering. If the road to agriculture was long and not the result of conscious choice, well, then what took so long in the grand scheme of things? In all the various interglacial periods of the Pleistocene epoch, why didn't farming evolve during those times? You know, there were certainly plenty of people around in Africa and Eurasia. Why didn't the Neanderthals or the Denisovans farm? Well, these are all good questions, but at the moment, it's hard to say. The most common explanation was tied to geography and population density. Under the assumption that the earliest Homo sapiens and its kin were all nomadic foragers, and it's seeming increasingly likely that that wasn't always the case, well, then their populations would have been so widely scattered that the labor required for agricultural practices just wasn't there. And on top of that, the environmental conditions of the past 300,000 years or so haven't always been as stable as they were during the Holocene. Recall the consistent droughts that struck Africa during the Middle Pleistocene, or the fact that ice sheets had rested above Europe and turned much of that continent into tundra and taiga. The refugia that were present were far too small for human communities to have intensively harvested plants and animals without causing ecological damage.
Mm.
So, if anything, the question of what took so long, well, maybe that's misleading itself. You know, who's to say that farming is a natural consequence of human evolution?
Mm.
Any more than bipedalism or language. We've already have a good number of examples of forager societies that developed sedentism and collected wild resources without turning to agricultural practices. So perhaps a simple explanation may be that farming didn't emerge earlier because it just didn't. And so, with that in mind, just how farming societies arose around the world, well, that has been a constant source of debate. Since at least the 1930s, several hypotheses have emerged to explain which factors led to some foragers from their intensive land management towards agriculture. So, just to kind of go through a few, there's sedentism, for one. People started settling down in permanent villages, and so they needed ready supplies of food to sustain themselves because they weren't always able to travel far to engage in hunts, especially if other lands were already occupied by other sedentary foragers. Intensive cultivation could have turned into farming through this process. There's also environmental changes. A sudden cold or warm snap places serious pressures on certain human populations, and those that upped their intensive cultivation practices and survived eventually developed into farmers. There's also population pressures, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the sedentism argument.
Mm.
More people living together means more food is needed to feed them all. And if the landscape doesn't have predictable booms of wild resources, well, then it becomes crucial to focus on favored local crops and then further increasing their yields. And then, of course, we have various socio-cultural factors. We had briefly talked about the hypothesis of the late Klaus Schmidt, who worked at Göbekli Tepe, that the foragers who were constructing this monumental lithic structure needed ready supplies of food for energy to build these things in the first place. And perhaps the emergence of new cultural traditions provided the necessities for intensive cultivation to turn into farming. Maybe there were incentives to direct cultivated resources towards leaders of increasing importance or towards particular religious rituals. And this led to the start of farming as tribute or as offerings. Now, all of these hypotheses and more have been proposed over the years, and they all have their merits and they all have their flaws. The fact that agriculture emerged multiple times around the world in so many different environments requires us to think clearly whenever any one hypothesis is discussed.
Mm.
It may be that different factors worked in different parts of the world to give rise to agricultural societies. So, really, any of these models could hold truth. Now, one particularly integrative hypothesis was recently spearheaded by Robert Spengler III and colleagues that the birth of agriculture was through an ecological phenomenon known as mutualism.
Mm. Right.
This is when different species form a symbiotic relationship where both gain benefits from each other. It's this sort of coevolution that, for example, gave rise to flowering plants during the Cretaceous period because they worked through the pollination of various insect groups. So this hypothesis goes, following the demise of the megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene, vast numbers of plant species were left without primary dispersers. And increasing human presence on the landscape meant that many of these plants were being sought out by foraging populations and incorporated into intensive land management practices. Seed dispersal is important to plants. It's how they spread their populations. So perhaps at various points, crop species began to co evolve with their human caretakers by developing traits that made seed dispersal easier. This way, the plants had much better chances of surviving into future generations thanks to human harvesting. And humans now had ever more reliable and easier food resources to sustain their populations. And thus, we get a positive feedback loop. And before long, you have plant species that have become domesticated, and they are only able to breed through the hand of the farmer.
Mm.
And this is a very fascinating hypothesis to me. And it actually has more context to global events. So recall that there are many plant species called evolutionary anachronisms that have only survived due to human cultivation. And many of these plants belong to notable crop species that we enjoy today. Now, of course, more archaeological and biological work will, of course, be needed to kind of further test this particular hypothesis. But it does leave out one key aspect of agriculture, our livestock.
Mm.
How did animal domestication start? Well, I mean, it was probably through just the same sort of process that we discussed earlier, a natural outgrowth of wild land management. So, game hunting goes back many tens of thousands of years, obviously. And it was common for hunters to corral small herds of animals into enclosed areas like bogs for easier killing.
Mm.
Think, for example, about the intensive hunts of the Solutreans after reindeer, or of the Natufians after gazelles. It's an easy step from just outright killing a herd of corral animals to just trapping a herd of animals and keeping them alive until their meat or skins were needed. Uh, the management of wild herds would have required little effort or change of direction from before. It's just a matter of making sure the animals themselves never leave human sight. And before long, the animals might come to think of the farmers as members of the herd. And so the path to domestication begins. So we jump to the next slide now. What exactly is domestication? For our purposes, it's tied directly to human action. A population of plants or animals whose reproductive cycles are maintained directly and solely by humans. It's not necessarily tied with agriculture. Remember that the wolf was domesticated under foraging populations in Eurasia. And I said for our purposes because there are a few cases where non-human animals have domesticated another species. One of my favorite examples are the leafcutter ants
Mm.
of the
Yep.
Americas. Yeah, they have farmed and domesticated species of fungus to the point where that fungus can only grow through the actions of the ants.
Right.
So a key component of domestication is selective breeding, or what is known as artificial selection. This was famously coined by Charles Darwin during his early studies. It's called artificial because it's humans who are doing the selecting, not nature itself. And we can look among our stocks of grains or herds of livestock and pick which traits we like the most, and then breed the organisms that share those traits to encourage its spread through the overall population. So it's evolution on a minute and quick scale. If we want a grass with larger seeds or a pig with more meat on its bones, with the right resources, we can make it so. Sometimes selection produces surprising results that give enormous benefits to the selectors. Given the extraordinary plasticity of certain plant and animal species, it's very easy to do so. It's important to keep in mind that for the thousands of years of the domestication process, the underlying genetic processes that occurred during artificial selection were unknown. Obviously, things like genes weren't known about until the last couple decades or so, and we only knew about DNA and how that worked fairly recently. So it's not like the early farmers in the Neolithic ages they were masters of genetics.
Right.
it was
Right.
just it happened how it did. So many of our domesticated plants share similar traits that mark their distinction from wild ancestors. I've already mentioned large seeds, easier to gather and much more edible and malleable. And the same goes to fruits as well. So many of the fruits that we enjoy today are much larger than their wild ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wild apples and peaches are actually quite tiny. They,
Right.
they look like berries. Um, the rachis, so that's the part of the stem that bears the flowers of domestic plants, like grains, are usually much tougher than those of wild varieties. They're only able to be broken off and collected if they're threshed with a sickle. It's more work, but that means that less seeds are lost in the harvest. And there may also be changes in inflorescence, or how the flowers are arranged on the stem itself. And this is especially seen in plants like maize or corn. You can see in the images here, where the number of kernels has increased dramatically from their wild ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's parthenocarpy, so fruits that can be bred without seeds. It's very helpful when there's food you want to enjoy, but it's so crammed full of seeds that the experience just sucks. There's two prominent examples of this: the watermelon and bananas. You can buy these fruits today with no seeds whatsoever, but if you ever cut open their wild ancestors, you'd be amazed that we were able to get that way at all.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one final plant trait is the thinning of testae, that is the outer shell of the seed. We're able to enjoy things like quinoa because their seeds aren't as tough to chew through as before. So clearly, when it comes to artificial selection of plants, the process can offer widely divergent body plans. And because of the timescales these plants grow in, humans have been able to get results fairly quickly, and with the change in only a few genes in some cases. Now, in regards to our domestic animals, that's a much different story. Because while hundreds of plant species have been cultivated and domesticated, the number of animals that we've taken under our wings is actually quite small. Sure, we've been able to tame hundreds of animals.
Mhm.
You recall that various foraging societies will take in wild animals as diverse as marsupials and birds of prey and raise them as pets. But this is not domestication. It certainly may have been a key role in that direction,
Mhm.
but still, the animals need their reproductive cycles controlled in order for that to happen. As far as the evidence suggests, only a few species seem viable for this process. And the reasons vary. Some animals just take too long to breed. The average gestation period of an African elephant is about 2 years, and it only produces one offspring, which can take at least 25 years to reach breeding age. And they require vast amounts of food and territory to be healthy, which is something that zoos have only just now begun to fix.
Mhm.
So even though elephants can be tamed, and there's plenty of examples of this, domestication is not realistic. Now, some other animals are just, really tough and far too dangerous to be around.
Right.
The American bison, as closely related to cattle as it is nothing like them. Any hint of danger is treated with galloping speed and pure muscle and bone. Like, you realize more people in Yellowstone National Park are injured by bison than by grizzly bears?
Wow.
Yeah, like a bear will just run you down, but a bison will knock you in the air and trample you.
Right.
And there's no sense of trying to corral a bison either. I mean, according to the National Park Service, they can jump as much as 1.5 meters high vertically.
Cripes.
Yeah, so that's something. Now, of course, there are farmed bison today.
Mhm.
That's how we get those delicious non-fatty bison burgers and steaks. But that's after years of being interbred with domestic cattle. And zebras have a similar problem. They're horses, sure, but having evolved in an environment with lions and hyenas and human hunters means that they're not very trusting.
Mhm.
That's another thing too. Some animals are just way too skittish and fearful for domestication. There's a reason you don't see farms full of white-tailed deer or Thompson's gazelle. I've seen plenty of video footage showing how desperate a deer can be when it's trapped in an unfamiliar closed space.
Mhm.
They'd sooner kill themselves than stay shut in.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah, so in essence, if you look at the livestock we have today and then look at their wild ancestors, provided they're not extinct, you find a lot of similarities that link them all. They tend to be herding or flocking animals with defined social structures, and they're fairly docile and approachable in an ecosystem without too many predators, and they have a high reproductive rate, leading to an early age for sexual maturity. And so that has left the human populations of the world with only 14 large mammal species. And this is unevenly distributed around the world as well.
Mhm.
And of course, we have several small mammals and birds and a few other organisms too. As far as the selection process goes, domesticated animals have gone through many similar changes to their morphology, including an overall shrinkage in size from their wild counterparts. So, wild sheep are bigger than domestic sheep, for example. So, back in episode 8, we looked at self domestication and how animals will develop new phenotypic traits as they're selected for friendlier behaviors. And part of the domestication process that benefits humans the most is friendlier animals. I mean, why work with livestock that constantly tried to harm you? So, as the tamest animals are bred with each other, you may recall, their bodies undergo distinct changes. The size of their ears, snouts, teeth, and brains shrink. The tails become curly, the skin becomes depigmented, and sprouts spots and piebald coloration. And especially important, reproductive cycles grow more frequent. So, of course, more babies means more food and more opportunities for artificial selection. So while other animals like ants have domesticated other species, I mean, the scope and intensity of human domestication of plants and animals is clearly unique. It was this widespread change of so many species that helped Charles Darwin understand how evolution worked in the first place. And our livestock and food crops continue to provide powerful examples of that amazing process. So, before moving on to our historical narrative, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add about domestication or agriculture?
Well, I think you did a very good overview. I guess one thing I'll add is I'll plug Katrina Van Grauw's book, Unnatural Selection. Um,
Yes.
yeah, it's an amazing book, and she would be the first one to say that it is not a book about domestication per se,
Hmm.
um, but it's more about what happens after domestication. That is artificial selection, as we just discussed. And so she just talks about and gives many examples of artificially selected traits in domesticated animals and how they've managed to dramatically change compared to their wild ancestors through this process, and some of the kind of underlying processes that govern that, as well as what it can teach us about evolutionary biology in general, because there's actually quite a bit we can learn from artificial selection about natural selection. And famously, Darwin opened up his book on the origin of species with a discussion of artificial selection and not jumping directly to his theory of natural selection. Um,
Hmm.
and despite that, I think Katrina makes a point that artificial selection has been rather overlooked often in studies of evolutionary biology, even though it actually does have a lot to tell us about the subject. So it's a great book because it makes that case, and also it's very well illustrated. Katrina is a fantastic artist, and so
Hmm.
yeah, she has lots of illustrations of skeletons, but also of other live animals as well, and looking at all these different interesting features and doing a real deep dive into them. So yeah, it's a great book. Check it out.
Absolutely, and we'll be sure to put a link in the description if
Yeah, we
you all
should.
want to support her and purchase it. Because yeah, I second that. I received my copy relatively recently, and I've fallen in love with it. It's a beautiful book. So yeah, let's jump to the next slide here. Um, for most of the remainder of this series, we're going to be exploring how agriculture emerged independently around the world, perhaps as much as 16 times or
Wow.
more. And so, yeah, there's a lot of ground to cover, literally. So we'll be touring the planet one region at a time. Now, as the numbers here indicate, we'll start with the earliest sites for domestication, that's Southwest Asia, and then move from Europe to South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and then on to the Pacific Islands and Australia.
Hmm.
And we hop across the Indian Ocean back to Africa, and then hop across the Atlantic to the Americas.
All right.
Along the way, we'll see how the primary centers of farming spread outwards into other inhabited lands, and they brought crops, animals, technologies, peoples, and languages with them. And I think you'll find that much of the demographics of our modern world, at least before colonization and globalization, was really shaped during these expansions. It's a really fascinating aspect of human prehistory, so much so that I'm going to be sure to share as much as I can about it. So let's get started on the next slide. The archaeological evidence seems very clear that the first region on Earth where true agricultural societies emerged was in Southwest Asia. Following the brief cold snap of the Younger Dryas, which had turned this part of the world into an uncomfortably dry place, conditions improved greatly. The Southwest Asia of 11,700 years ago was a much wetter and more productive environment than today. Moisture winds from the Mediterranean Sea mixed with higher levels of rainfall to expand the biodiverse refugia into, vaster landscapes across the region. As far south as the Arabian Peninsula, you could find extensive river systems, lush wetlands, and open woodlands of oaks, willows, and palms. And most importantly for our story, the grasslands and marshes of the Fertile Crescent and the hilly flanks of the higher elevations had large fields of grains. Emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley were the most prominent. So, following the collapse of the Natufian settlements, whose descendants retained the knowledge of cultivating seeds, communities started settling down again into villages, and the practice of agriculture began rapidly. Traditionally, it was thought that this occurred only once, after which the practice spread across the Fertile Crescent via a nifty package of crops and livestock. But we've since learned through further archaeological work and genetic studies that this process was much more complicated than that. It turns out agriculture developed here not once, but at least 3 times
Wow.
across Southwest Asia. By looking at the ancient DNA of recovered skeletons, geneticists have revealed that the foraging populations of the Levant, Anatolia, and the Zagros Mountains of Iran were quite regionally distinct from each other, suggesting many thousands of years of isolation had occurred prior to the Holocene. And it may be even appropriate to add to those southern Mesopotamia. Now, the origins of the Sumerians has been a long-standing mystery. Their language is an isolate. It's unrelated to any living language today. And so their presence in the historical record is also markedly unique from their Semitic-speaking neighbors in northern Mesopotamia. And attempts to link them to further flung cultures like India or Iran have failed. So then we had an interesting 2011 genetic study by Nadia Al-Zari and colleagues, which sequenced the DNA of the Marsh Arabs, and who are wetland agriculturalists from Iraq. And they're well known for their skills in reed weaving. It turns out that most of their mitochondrial and Y chromosomal DNA has basically had a long-standing presence in this region, and it received very little admixture from other Southwest Asian groups. And this suggests very strongly, as had been previously argued, that they are the descendants of the Sumerians, which can then be considered indigenous inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia. Now, more research would be needed to be sure, especially from Sumerian remains themselves, but it does suggest that this historical group might have been among the many who first picked up agriculture here over 9,000 years ago. Now, the distribution of the Southwest Asian staple crops is also a key to this new understanding of distinct origins. In the Levant and Anatolia, for example, was where einkorn wheat and barley usually grew, while in the Zagros Mountains, emmer wheat was more common. And all regions did share crops too. We had wild chickpeas, lentils, and peas that grew throughout the region. And we see similar trends among domesticated animals too. While cattle and pigs share a wide distribution, goats and sheep are only found in Anatolia and the Zagros. And so the general package of plants and animals was eventually spread across Southwest Asia, and the general homogeny of the genomes between Middle Eastern peoples today emerged from the result of increased contact between farming communities and their subsequent admixture. So, what was early farming like in Southwest Asia? How did it come about, and how were the different species of crops and livestock used? Well, as far as the selection pressures that led to agriculture, it has been suggested by researchers that an increase in communal food consumption practices was a key driver. Sites like Jerf el Amar in Syria, Jericho in Israel, and Ain Ghazal in Jordan show strong evidence for large-scale ritual ceremonies emerging very early into the Neolithic. So these are the descendants of the practices that may have underlied Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia. The need to maintain enough food to feed the growing populations may have driven human communities towards the types of farming practices needed to sustain such yields. Other primary and secondary uses proved immediately valuable. Of course, straw from harvested grasses went into use as thatch for roofing. Flax found its purpose as linen for weaving into clothes and blankets, as well as for linseed oil. And of course, there was the incorporation of different crops as food for livestock. And so the principal domesticated plants that hailed from across Southwest Asia are, of course, emmer and einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, flax, almonds, and fava beans. And most of these plants were fully domesticated by 9,500 to 9,000 years ago, now distinct from their wild ancestors. Handy tools for cultivating and harvesting these crops had already been present from the start. Wooden and bone sickles with stone microblades for reaping grains. There were stone pestles and mortars for grinding the seeds, and wooden digging sticks for planting the seeds, among others. Now, one prominent tool that was missing was clay pottery. Well, that wouldn't be invented here until about 8,500 years ago. Not to worry, of course, Neolithic farmers could collect harvests just fine with weaved baskets, animal skins, and gut pouches. Now, on the mammalian side of things, we owe Southwest Asia for the four most common mammalian livestock today: goats, sheep, taurine cattle, and pigs. Now, the uses of these animals is often tied to their flesh. It seems that thousands of years of intensive hunting had reduced the populations of certain favored game animals like gazelles, so that by 8,000 years ago, these four-hoofed mammals made up the majority of people's meat diets. The general order in which these animals were domesticated offers interesting clues about this early history. The goat was domesticated first in Anatolia 10,500 years ago, and perhaps later in the Zagros, followed by the sheep soon afterwards. Now, these two animals are close relatives, and they would have been fairly common game animals originally, proving far more docile and manageable for domestication than gazelles, for example. Now, primarily they were used for meat, as well as for their skins. Sheep wool comes later, and by 8,500 years ago, for milk. Now, since humans couldn't originally digest milk beyond their younger years, it was necessary for milk to be fermented
Hmm.
and then turned into yogurts and cheeses. And just why people started milking goats and sheep in the first place, it's hard to say. But by the time taurine cattle were domesticated 8,000 years ago, they were also being milked. Now, on a very curious note, actually, early depictions from Neolithic sites show that people originally milked cows from behind,
Huh.
because that's how you milk a goat, which remember is an earlier domesticate. And eventually, the easier side milking solution was found.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. Now, before cattle, the pig was the third animal that was introduced into Neolithic life. It was fully domesticated for meat by 8.8 thousand years ago. Now, of course, concerning all of these animals, use of their waste as fertilizer was a smart invention as well. Now, agriculture and its influences spread far and wide from Southwest Asia. Anatolian farmers introduced the practice to Europe. Levantine farmers brought crops and animals to North Africa, and Zagros farmers contributed to the start of South Asian agriculture. Now, new discoveries are adding to this picture too. For the past few years, our knowledge about Green Arabia has grown tremendously, and it is now being realized that far from being a vast desert sparsely populated by nomadic groups, the Arabia of 10.5 to 6,000 years ago was a much more fertile place, densely settled by human communities who used plants and animals domesticated from the Levantine farmers. I mean, just last week, a very important paper was released by Hugh Thomas and colleagues, and in it, the authors discussed the widespread presence of mustatiles across Arabia. These are rectangular stone monuments with complex chambers and short walls that can reach enormous sizes. I mean, some of the things that they've uncovered are over 600 meters long. And researchers suggest that these structures had ritual functions and belonged to so called cattle cults. Excavations of one musatile revealed chambers full of cow bones and horns. Now, this is like ongoing work as we speak. And it'll be exciting to see how these discoveries shape our picture of Neolithic life in Southwest Asia. So let's jump to the next slide. And this just gives a brief overview of what archaeologists call the aceramic,
Hmm.
or the pre pottery Neolithic of Southwest Asia. This is the time before, you guessed it, clay pottery. But it also records the overall trends from foraging 11,700 years ago to fully fledged farming with domestic crops and animals 8,500 years ago. There are two ages distinguished here, PPNA and PPNB, which roughly correlate to different cultivation practices. The PPNA communities were still regularly engaged in hunting and gathering of wild resources, but were also dedicated farmers, while PP&B communities were moving away from wild resources and fully domesticating their plants and animals. Now, throughout this time, wild and domestic species still traded DNA with each other, but as we've just learned, this would change very soon. Farming villages during the pre-pottery Neolithic grew to impressive sizes. Last episode, I mentioned a tiny bit about Jericho. Its transformation from simple village to enormous walled town happened in just a few thousand years. And to this day, the famous tower and walls of Jericho, which is visible in the image here at the right, remains a bit of a mystery. We're not sure why they were built in the first place. Suggestions vary from defense against raiders to flood control. What is important to mention, of course, is that the Jericho, as described in the Tanakh, was of a much later age. This settlement was built, abandoned, and then rebuilt multiple times across its history. And we have other sites like Jarmo in Iraq, dated 9,000 years ago, that show more modest farming villages, but ones nonetheless connected to the wider world. And it's because interactions between communities grew very widely towards the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Concerning Jarmo, we find evidence of obsidian, turquoise, and marine shellfish, which geologic and biological studies show derived from much farther away. And similar finds come from Anatolia and the Levant. So we know that by this time, peoples were engaged in long distance trade, which is different, remember, from population expansion, which is not to say this still wasn't important. One of the most remarkable stories of the pre pottery Neolithic concerns the domestication of a very special animal, the cat.
Hmm.
Now, despite evidence of prior settlement by foraging people, farmers first migrated to the island of Cyprus 10,500 years ago, bringing with them crops as well as introducing certain wild animals for game hunting. The site of Chiluracambos contains the oldest known evidence of human-cat interactions. A 9,500-year-old burial of an adult with their 8-month-old kitten,
Hmm.
surrounded by offerings of ochre, polished stones, and seashells. Now, genetic evidence suggests that the cat was domesticated at roughly this time from a number of different wild cat subspecies across Southwest Asia, and its incorporation into human societies was likely commensal at first. Of course, the newly emerging grain surpluses would have attracted seed eating rodents, and so cats would have been very great helpers in catching them. Cats do show these signatures of self domestication. For example, they have depigmentation, reduced ears and snouts and brains, and more frequent reproductive cycles. And this is really what makes them distinct from their wild cat relatives. Otherwise, they look very similar, and they will still rarely interbreed with each other when given the chance. So that about covers the Neolithic of Southwest Asia. Albert, do you have anything to add?
Not especially.
Alrighty. And of course, like the episode 9, the cat pictured here is my sister's cat,
Oh yeah.
Barbara, who is just a delight. Oh, the stories I could tell. But we have to move on now. So let's jump to the next slide. Uh, as I've mentioned several times before in this series, agriculture was introduced into Europe by foragers from Southwest Asia, specifically Anatolia. Given the rich archaeology that has been done in Europe, it's no surprise that we generally have a good understanding of the chronology of farming spread across 2,700 years, only further enhanced by discoveries in ancient DNA. Beginning around 8.7 thousand years ago, Anatolian farmers made their way westward onto the Aegean, establishing Neolithic cultures on Crete and the Grecian islands. And then, around 8,000 years ago, they had expanded across the Mediterranean to Italy, before reaching southern France and Iberia by 7.3 thousand years ago. Meanwhile, along a route across the Danube River, Anatolian farmers had spread from Central Europe 8,000 years ago. And they then radiated to northern France along the Rhine River by 7,000 years ago, and it would be another 1,000 years before farming reached the British Isles and southern Scandinavia. As we discussed in the last episode, the transition from Mesolithic foraging societies to Neolithic farming societies was gradual but ultimately wholesale. Today, the Mesolithic imprints on living European DNA is small compared to that of the Neolithic ones, though not at equal levels. But that doesn't mean that the foraging populations didn't adopt farming against their will. Environmental evidence suggests they had already become very familiar with a number of wild species ancestral to domesticates. For example, we know that barley and other cereals were growing in the Balkans prior to the arrival of farmers, and there were wild sheep, pigs, and cattle roaming the woods of Central Europe since the last ice age. The latter, of course, being the aurochs, famous large bulls that managed to hang on until the medieval ages in their wild form. And we can track the spread of certain crops and livestock across Europe through various sites. So we can be sure that the same species that were domesticated in Southwest Asia, like wheat, peas, lentils, and cattle, sheep, and pigs, were brought to new lands across Europe. Now, some species became important aspects of the local cultures. In the Neolithic of Greece, for example, sheep and cattle were highly valued. And we see this reflected in Homer's Odyssey, where the character Odysseus, his wealth and status is measured by his heads of cattle.
Hmm.
But that didn't mean that the adoption of crops and livestock was completely one-sided. In time, native European species were bred alongside the introduced species. It's from here where we get the first domestic olives, grapes, figs, turnips, oats, cabbages, parsnips, thyme, and oregano, as well as the opium poppy. Now, for domesticated animals, the gray-legged goose hailed from Europe.
Hmm.
The widespread distribution of wild boars actually seems to have played a role in the world of pig farming. Turns out genetics indicates that all of Europe's native pig breeds descend from such intense interbreeding with wild boars that the ancestral Anatolian signature is almost non existent.
Wow.
Now, you might think that the arrival in Europe, would have immediately changed the landscape in dramatic ways, quickly deforesting vast swaths of the region. But evidence from preserved pollen tells a different picture. In the northern hemisphere, where the boreal forests are, we see very little changes in size and composition when groups like the funnel-beaker culture arrive, and all the way into late classical times 1.7 thousand years ago. In the temperate deciduous forests in the mid latitudes, by contrast, there were notable changes in forest cover as land was cleared for agriculture, but this occurred at a very gradual pace. It wasn't until 3,000 years ago that the forests of Central Europe still covered around 63% of their former range. Much of the continent was still moderately forested, but the old growth forests would be living on borrowed time. Now, there is an extensive list of known cultural traditions that mark the various stages of agricultural development in Europe, of which only a few I have time to highlight. So recall that the use of clay pottery only emerged in Southwest Asia by 8,500 years ago. We don't see evidence of it in the earliest European farming communities of the Aegean. It's too early. But in time, that practice spread right across the region and came to be used by archaeologists as a good marker of the spread of cultures. And the main spread of cultures and farmers across the Mediterranean is represented by the Cardium pottery cultures, who were in place around 7,500 years ago. Now, for you mollusks fans, the name should be familiar to you. The clay pottery was actually pressed with cockle shells to make designs before they were fired.
Hmm.
And the fact that these marine clams were so heavily used lines up well with other evidence that demonstrates that the Cardium cultures relied on the Mediterranean for much of their livelihoods. They would construct boats for travel across the seas. In the Balkans, the Starshov culture of 8.2 thousand years ago, and this is named after a village in Serbia, marks the beginnings of agriculture spread into north central Europe. The connections to Anatolia can be clearly seen in the dwelling types here, which were a first for Europe. Homes that were built of wooden frame and then lined with clay that was thatched with straw. Now, as farmers spread north, new cultures emerged from this package. The most widespread and familiar of these are the linear pottery cultures, or linear banderkeramic, in place from 7,500 years ago. The distinction in pottery is marked by linear patterns incised on the outsides, which came in a variety of forms. In time, these styles of dwellings changed too, because the mud and wood homes of earlier times were not long lasting, nor were they really waterproof for
Hmm.
long periods of time. So, with the linear pottery sites, do we see the large wooden longhouses with straw thatched roofs surrounded by ditches and clusters of settlements that increase over time from hamlets with 15 hectares of territory to much larger villages guarded by raised earth? Now, the farmers who settled Scandinavia belonged to the funnel beaker culture, which originated 6.3 thousand years ago. Again, another people named for their pottery, this time for the cylindrical funnel shapes of their pots. Now, interestingly, the Scandinavian foragers who had lived here since the Mesolithic seemed to show the most eagerness to adopt agricultural practices, and they were not displaced like other forager populations in Europe. The ancient DNA of farmers here contains a high percentage of forager ancestry. Further to the west, from the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles, a number of fascinating cultural traditions emerges. And they're all based around very big rocks. So if we go to the next slide, of course, I'm talking about megaliths.
Hmm.
So between about 6.5 and 4.2 thousand years ago, a number of cultures across Western Europe were erecting enormous stones into some very unique structures. Right away, I should make clear Europe wasn't the only part of the world doing this sort of thing. Of course, we talked about Göbekli Tepe, but there were other societies from India to the Korean Peninsula to the Pacific Islands that practiced this type of construction. The amount of time and effort needed to create megalithic structures only demonstrates the power of humans when we work together.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, no, aliens weren't involved at all in any of this. Um, I hope I shouldn't have to say that.
Right.
European megalithic sites are world renowned tourist destinations, and I'm sure many of our viewers will have no doubt visited some of these places, or at least know them well. I have not had the opportunity. Uh, Albert, I don't know about you. You live in the UK. Have you visited any of these places?
Yeah, I visited Stonehenge, and yeah, it's quite impressive to see in person. And they have a lot of signs and guided audio tours to help you understand what we know about it, and yeah, it's pretty cool.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, that Stonehenge needs no major introduction.
Right.
It's located in Wiltshire, England, and it's probably one of the most famous of all the megalithic cultures of Europe. It was built in successive stages between 4.9 to 4.4 thousand years ago. And it consists of two rings of sandstone blocks, and some of these weigh 22.7 metric tons, which were excavated and carried from two locations several tens of kilometers away. Now, usually observed from view, no, usually obscured from view, uh, unless they were seen from above, are the series of ditches and banks that extends out across the sandstone megaliths.
Hmm.
Now, these are remnants of an earlier construction, in fact, the earliest construction, when the only stones of Stonehenge were a series of small, and by being small, I mean 3.6 metric tons, uh, these blue stones that were secured into a ring of about 56 holes. Now, of course, other sites are equally breathtaking, but very strikingly different. Most notable of these is Newgrange in the County Meath in Ireland, which is dated 5.2 thousand years ago, and it measures around 91 meters in diameter. Uh, it's a passage tomb, so the megaliths were arranged into a chambered architecture and then covered in mounds of earth, all except the center, which sported a rectangular hole that was sealed with a quartz shutter. And the inside is decorated with beautiful zigzags and spirals that were carved into the rocks themselves. And of course, the biggest questions archaeologists have asked about these structures is what were they used for?
Hmm.
Well, some definitely functioned as tombs. At Newgrange, for instance, human burials have been found, and some have been cremated. And they were laid to rest with abundant grave goods, things like jewelry and tools. And we do find evidence that Stonehenge, at its earliest usage at least, contained burials too. But, was that all that they were used for? Their purposes for ceremony have been proposed on and off again by different researchers. Places where farming communities pilgrimaged every year to honor rituals that have long since been forgotten. And these rituals might have had something to do with astronomical matters. It's long been understood that many of these megalithic sites are oriented to particular celestial phenomena. During midsummer and midwinter, the sunset is perfectly aligned along opposite views of the Trilithion arc at Stonehenge. And at Newgrange, when the quartz shutter is removed from the roof during the winter solstice, the light from the sun hits directly at the center of the floor, and it gradually gets brighter and brighter until the entire inside is light up from just this one little spotlight. And similar observations have been seen elsewhere. As many as 177 megalithic tombs across the Iberian Peninsula are all built oriented to the sunrise of certain days. Now, whatever meanings their human constructors gave to these astronomical phenomena, and we may never know, but it does at least reveal, or at least further reveal, the scientific genius that prehistoric humans have been able to construct such massive megalithic structures in these ways.
Hmm.
And so that covers Neolithic Europe. Albert, do you have anything else to add?
Not really.
Alrighty, and then we can move on to the next slide now. Talk about the story of agriculture in South Asia.
Hmm.
And we got a very similar situation to that of Europe, because so far as the evidence tells us, farming was similarly introduced from Southwest Asia, and as the practice spread, local plants and animals were domesticated. From 9,000 years ago, farmers from the Zagros began expanding into the Indian subcontinent. Over the next 4,000 years or so, many peoples across the region had taken up the practice, from the Indus to the Ganges and down into the Deccan Plateau.
Hmm.
But they still maintained fairly active hunter gatherer lifestyles. There's still some discourse as to the genetic and linguistic nature of contact between these Zagros farmers and the native South Asian foragers. So, DNA evidence shows that admixture occurred along the Indus Valley by 7.4 thousand years ago, and that these populations later spread as far as Sri Lanka, following the collapse of the Harappan cultures 3.7 thousand years ago. These peoples are known to ancient DNA researchers as ancestral South Indians. It has been heavily speculated whether the distribution of the Dravidian language family across South Asia corresponds to these movements. But to date, we are still not sure. And we'll explore a little bit more about this in the next episode. In any case, agricultural lifeways have been documented at various sites across South Asia, most notably the village of Murgar, which was established very early at the beginning of farming 9,000 years ago. Evidence for trade networks with the Zagros region is quite prominent because we find Southwest Asian turquoise, copper, and seashells at that site.
Hmm.
The evidence of foreign crops is also well known. The people of Murgar grew wheat and they raised goats that are related to Southwest Asian domesticates. And other younger sites across South Asia are less well known, but they do share commonalities in the types of crops used and where the people decided to settle down. The river systems seem to have been especially favored because we find farming communities along the Ganges as well as the Indus by 5.5 thousand years ago. As in Europe, we owe South Asia for a number of particular plants and animals that were domesticated from native species. We have two species of millet, little and brown top. We have sesame seeds, mung beans, pigeon peas, and cucumbers.
Hmm.
That's to name some crops that were in place between 4.5 and 3,000 years ago. And at least two large mammals, the zebu cattle
Hmm.
and the water buffalo. Now, zebu cattle belong to the same species as the taurine cattle of Southwest Asia. They actually shared a common ancestor at least 250,000 years ago, which would mean that cattle were domesticated twice.
Hmm.
The domestication of zebus seems to have occurred around 8,500 years ago, but the water buffalo, which is a much more distantly related species, wasn't used for agriculture until 6.3 thousand years ago. Now, both these animals were bred for meat and for milk, but they are most well known for their use as draught animals, which we'll also explore more in the next episode. Now, we'll return to the cultural legacies of Southwest Asian agriculture in a little bit, but for now, as we move east across Eurasia, we enter the second oldest region in the world where farming emerged independently. If we go to the next slide, we will see that this is East Asia.
Hmm.
So soon after the start of the Holocene, by 11,000 years ago, we see evidence of agricultural activity along two of East Asia's great river systems, the Huanghe, or Yellow River, in the north, and the Yangtze River in the south. Both regions supported sedentary communities who relied on two very specific crops for their livelihoods, as we've seen in the last episode. Broom corn and foxtail millet were the staple crops of the Huanghe farmers, while rice dominated life for the Yangtze farmers.
Hmm.
Key technologies that remained important from the last Pleistocene times included pottery, which is widespread at Chinese sites and came in distinct forms from culture to culture. The farmers of the Huanghe relied on loess soils to fertilize their millet crops. That's what makes loess soil so good, is that it's both light textured and it's very porous. So it easily takes in rainwater and can be quickly tilled. And quite a number of distinct cultures are known in the archaeological record to have developed along the Huanghe River. Among the oldest of these is the Pelagian culture, which has flourished between 8.3 and 7.1 thousand years ago. People who lived and farmed here built semi-subterranean homes with separate structures that acted as cemeteries, and they stored their harvests in large storage pits. When we reach the later Yangshao culture of 6.8 to 5.2 thousand years ago, the farming villages had grown tremendously, and homes were now being built on top of raised earth terraces for protection against flooding. But the floods were valued as well because they helped fertilize the millet fields. From the Huanghe farmers, we not only got millet, but also soybeans, sorghum, mulberries, and our old friend cannabis.
Hmm.
Although I should say hemp, because this plant was mostly used to make fibers for clothing
Hmm.
and other materials before it was, smoked. Now, based on linguistic evidence, it seems that the Orhaimat of the Sino-Tibetan language family, which includes, the most familiar Chinese languages like Mandarin and Jin, was in the Huanghe River Valley. And as communities spread across East Asia, they not only brought their farming practices, but their languages with them. We see this on the Tibetan Plateau by 5,500 years ago, where native buckwheat was domesticated. In a similar vein, millet growing cultures developed in present day Mongolia, best exemplified by the Zhenglongwa culture of 8.2 to 7.4 thousand years ago. They and their immediate neighbors may have been the original speakers of two Central Asian language families, Turkic and Mongolic, and DNA evidence suggests that these languages were local developments and not linguistically tied to Sino Tibetan. The story of the rice growing cultures of the Yangtze River ran in parallel with the Huanghe millet cultures for many thousands of years. And they occasionally shared crops and technologies with each other. For example, we find rice along the Huanghe as early as 8,500 years ago. But what makes rice distinct from millet is that it is an aquatic plant by nature. It grows in shallow marshes and disperses its seeds by flowing water, often by flooding from the Yangtze. Early foragers learned that if water is maintained at certain depths, rice will grow without conflict from weeds. And so you can see in many of the early rice farming societies, like the Hemdu culture of 7.5 to 5.3 thousand years ago, they would arrange their lives to work with the wetlands. Some homes were built on raised earth like the Huanghe, but others were actually supported by wooden beams and posts planted into the muddy soil. And people could take their boats from their doorstep and fish along the river or hunt along the banks to supplement their diet. As in the north, the Yangtze farmers domesticated other plants alongside rice. It's from them that we get peaches, apricots, melons, water calthrop, and pink lotus. Now, as far as the history of language is concerned, the Yangtze cultures were discovered to be very important. Genetic and linguistic evidence suggests another of southern Chinese and Southeast Asian language families, among them Huangmeng, or Mongmian, excuse me, Krai Dai, and Austronesian, ultimately hail from this part of the world, having traveled southwards along with the spread of rice farming. And we'll explore more of this in a little bit. Now, a brief word on animal domesticates. We know that pigs were domesticated here independently from Southwest Asia 8,000 years ago by the Huanghe farming cultures, and then they dispersed widely across northern Asia. The swan goose, which is the domestic variety that is known for the fleshy head knob,
Hmm.
that also seems to have come from the north, at least prior to 3,000 years ago. This species is actually closely related to the gray lag goose of Europe, and it can't easily interbreed with it. Now, one funny domestication story concerns cats, but not our familiar species Felis sylvestris, which is what all the domestic cats today belong to. It seems that around 5,500 years ago, Huanghe farmers domesticated another species of cat, the leopard cat. Bones associated with settlement sites tell us that these cats were treated in a similar commensal setting as pest controllers. But however, today, domestic cats in East Asia belong to Felis sylvestris. And so that suggests that this happened not long after the initial domestication of the leopard cat. So, I guess preferences changed there.
Hmm.
Now, the water buffalo of East Asia belong to a distinct type from those of South Asia, and it seems that they too were also independently domesticated here between 7 and 3,000 years ago, but by the rice farming cultures of the Yangtze. And of course, no overview of East Asian domesticates would be complete without mentioning the silk moth. Now, I think it's safe to say that no other animal has had such an importance to Chinese culture
Hmm.
as this. Huanghe farmers over 5,000 years ago discovered that when you boil the larvae filled cocoons in water, they unwind into silky fibers many hundreds of meters long. And the practice of harvesting these silkworms, or sericulture as it's called, became very well known across much of eastern and southern Eurasia. And it wasn't until the mid 500s AD that silkworms were smuggled into Europe, famously. And so now we're going to trace the spread of agriculture from East Asia's rivers. But before we do so, Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Not too much. I will mention that I actually got to keep silkworms as a school project back when I was, oh, I don't know, like 11 years old, 10 years old, 10 years old, I think. It was interesting. However, unfortunately, mine did not live for very long. Um,
Aw.
yeah, basically, we had to feed them like mulberry leaves. That's their specialized diet, which makes sense in light of what species were domesticated in this region. Um, Uh, but the ones that I managed to get apparently were had been laced with pesticides, and so yeah, that didn't end very well. Um, uh, but I did get to see the ones that a lot of my classmates kept and metamorphosed, and yeah, it was they're quite distinctive looking animals for sure.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I've never had the pleasure of seeing a live silk moth
Hmm.
in a, I guess in a zoo context or whatever. But
Right.
I've always been fascinated by like the process. Yeah, like the people would make these huge beds of mulberry leaves and they would just feed them
Right.
constantly, and then boil the cocoons en masse, and you just get strips and strips and strips, and remarkable,
Yeah.
remarkable discovery.
Indeed.
So yeah, on the next slide here, um, when we last left the Japanese archipelago, it was mostly populated by sedentary foragers of the Jomon culture. As discussed previously, there is some debated evidence to suggest that these communities may have cultivated and domesticated a couple crops, including adzuki beans, barnyard millet, and a variety of soybean. But it's hard to say for sure. To the west of the islands is the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria, where Proto Korean and Proto Japonic speaking foragers live. There's been a lot of research into this part of the world, and a picture has gradually emerged that gives contexts for not only the spread of agriculture in this part of the world, but also the origins of both Korean and Japanese ancestry. A long standing linguistic hypothesis states that both the Korean and Japonic languages are closely related to those of Central Asia, including Tungusic, Turkic, and Mongolic. This is what you call the Altaic language family. We know from ancient DNA that both the Tungusic speaking Neo Siberians and the Turkic Mongolic speakers ultimately share ancestry from people who first settled East Asia over 40,000 years ago, both having gradually expanded northwards following that time. The first peoples of Korea share ancestry from these northern Asian groups, as well as later East Asian farming populations, who introduced the practice between 5 and 4,000 years ago. We know that through the Ryukyuan Islands, rice and barley agriculture had spread into Japan around 3,000 years ago. So, in any case, the populations on both the mainland and neighboring islands were familiar enough with farming.
Hmm.
This has superseded the previous understanding that farming only showed up in Japan through the Yayoi cultures 2,300 years ago. But the fact still rings true to an extent that the Yayoi culture marks the period when traditional Japanese culture begins on the islands. That's been well established. But just why did these people show up in Japan in the first place? Well, evidence strongly suggests that much of the Korean peninsula was inhabited by Japonic speaking peoples. For example, many place names in southern Bakje region are historically Japanese in origin. When rice agriculture spread via the Liaodong Peninsula 3,500 years ago, it ushered in a distinct archaeological culture called the Mamun, which began to grow very widespread. The Yayoi culture likely developed from the Mamun culture after that time, but both have been associated with the Japonic language family. The Korean language family seems to have emerged within Manchuria, associated with a Bronze Age farming culture. By 2,300 years ago, this population had moved southwards into the peninsula and interacted strongly with the Yayoi farmers, some communities of whom jumped ship and landed in Japan. And thus, Korea became, well, Korean, and Japan gained its Japanese via admixture with the descendants of the Jomon, which is where the Yamato ethnicity comes from. Now, fascinatingly, the transition from primarily Japonic to primarily Korean languages in the peninsula was not completely wholesale, and it seems that the two languages actually shared words with each other while simultaneously losing much of their original diversity in vocabulary. So, with all that being said, what was agriculture like in Korea and Japan? Well, the Mamoon farming villages of 3,500 to 2.3 thousand years ago shared some features with the Hwanghae cultures, as is expected since millet farming originated with them. Even though rice farming was present, it didn't make up a significant chunk of food resources. In fact, Mamoon farmers still engaged in regular hunting and fishing whenever they could. They built semi-subterranean homes and also constructed megalithic structures. The later Yayoi cultures also made their homes out of wood and stone, and the site of Yoshingari in Kyushu has revealed well preserved evidence of village life. In fact, if you can see in this image here, an entire village has been constructed at that site. And so early on, the Yayoi built pit houses too, as they had on the mainland. But later on, homes were built on raised wooden floors, guarded by huge ditches and palisades. And so I guess you can say the social stratification and defensive technology that was well documented in Japanese historical records began here. So if we jump to the next slide now, uh, if the spread of agriculture in northern East Asia seems complicated, its spread southwards was even more so.
Hmm.
The early history of Southeast Asia is remarkable, and that involves both cultural and endemic diffusion. It was not as simple as one population of farmers entered a region and displaced and replaced the local foragers, not by a long shot. Southeast Asia was originally populated by a number of different foraging peoples who engaged in both intensive cultivation of local plants and broad spectrum hunting and gathering. In any case, they were well versed in their local landscape, as foragers tend to be. We previously discussed the presence of the Hoabinhian cultures, who have been established in this part of the world since 43,000 years ago. The Austro-Asiatic languages, which include Mon, Khmer, and Vietnamese, have a widespread distribution from east of the Indian subcontinent to the south of mainland Southeast Asia. And it seems that the people who spoke these languages have had an especially long history there. Despite this, as recently as 10,500 years ago, the populations living near India and those near present day Vietnam and Thailand had diverged from each other for unknown reasons. Recent work in the Philippines, of course, has revealed other expansions by foraging peoples, including the widespread establishment of the so called Manobo like and Samo like populations around 12,000 years ago. Similar recent evidence shows that foragers had settled Taiwan over 8,000 years ago. These are the Cordilleran foragers, which are represented today by the Igorot peoples of Luzon. It was originally thought that this migration occurred much later, around 5,500 years ago, by farming peoples. But a recent ancient DNA study from last month by Jeremy Choyne and colleagues found evidence that extended the time scale and changed the context of things. And so this spread it into Taiwan associated with the Austronesian language family, whom we'll talk more about soon. All right, the first inklings of rice agriculture began to spread from the Yangtze River Valley around 7,000 years ago, when agriculturalists began expanding southwards en masse, establishing settlements across mainland Southeast Asia by 4,000 years ago. Another language family understood to have spread to this part of the world with these movements, Krai Dai, which includes Thai. And this shares close relations with Austronesian, incidentally. Genetic studies further validate these links. The Austroasiatic speakers underwent a notable decline in population with these incoming agriculturalists. And this can be seen when you look at a linguistic map of Southeast Asia today.
Hmm.
The wide distribution of Austroasiatic languages is pretty much wedged apart by the Krai Dai languages. But this decline was not total, which suggests that some Austroasiatic speakers adopted farming practices into their lives rather than focus on foraging. And in time, genetic evidence shows admixture occurred with the Yangtze farmers, so providing much of the ancestry of living Austroasiatic speaking peoples today. Now, other admixtures occurred too, especially with the Hoabinhian peoples. Thus, mainland Southeast Asia became a region of mostly agricultural communities, but one which some groups adopted farming and were not displaced. And of course, there were many pockets of foraging peoples still residing here and there, like the Andamanese. And it's during this time that farming cultures met along the lands between South Asia and Southeast Asia, which introduced rice and millet westward and barley and wheat eastward. Now, Southeast Asian farming communities resided in biodiverse tropical regions, so it's no surprise that coupled with indigenous knowledge of native cultivars, life here was especially rich. One particularly large site in Thailand is Kok Van Dam Di, dated between 4 to 3.4 thousand years ago. This was a rice growing village near a local mangrove swamp, and it spanned 5 hectares in width. There was fascinating evidence of social stratification here, including the presence of a woman who was buried under a pyramid of clay vessels with mountains of jewelry made from seashells covering her entire body. So, whoever this was, she was very special.
Hmm.
The legacy of domesticates from Southeast Asia includes a number of neat species. During our 2020 Roundup episode, I touched briefly upon the origins of our modern chickens. which have been traced to Southeast Asian jungle fowl 8,000 years ago,
Hmm.
based on DNA research. This area of study is still underway, and the specifics of chicken domestication are presently unclear. There seems to have been a lot of interbreeding between different subspecies of jungle fowl
Yeah.
and domestic chickens, so this has kind of complicated their history. And with the oldest archaeological evidence of chickens as far as the Huanghe River at 8,000 years ago, well, there's clearly large parts of the story that we don't understand yet.
Hmm.
More conclusive research on Southeast Asian crops is well known. It turns out that the globally distributed coconut, which has long been a mystery, has been traced to two separate domestication events, one in India by 3,000 years ago, and one in island Southeast Asia at an unclear date. Other notable crops in this region, some of which have been continuously cultivated by foragers beforehand, include taro, various yams, jackfruit, durians, sugarcane, and the pandanus palm tree. So, in that case, regarding the spread of farming in Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Uh, Not particularly. This is certainly an area that doesn't get much attention in a lot of historical overviews.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's usually I've found it's usually glossed over.
Hmm.
The prehistory is glossed over until you get to like the origins of the Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms.
Right, right.
But of course, you know me, I'm biased towards prehistory. There's certainly a lot of stuff here that should be more well known to
Hmm.
people in the popular literature. Um, so, okay, I purposely did not talk too much about the Austronesian speaking farmers and their ancestors because their story would prove to cover a much wider territory. If we jump to the next slide, one of the largest linguistic expansions in history was that of the Austronesian language family.
Hmm.
And it was the people who spoke these languages that went on to become the first humans ever to settle many of the greater Pacific islands,
Hmm.
further increasing our global distribution. And this understanding has been the end result of many decades of research into not just linguistics, but archaeology, human genetics, and indigenous oral history. And even now, new aspects of this expansion are being brought to light. And it all started in Taiwan over 8,000 years ago,
Hmm.
as Cordilleran foragers from southern China expanded southwards. Of course, prior to recent studies, it was thought these peoples lived in rice and millet farming communities. But we now know that those practices were introduced from the Yangtze River Valley much later in time, around 4,000 years ago, which would have established the genetic connections between these two regions. Further southward expansions into the Philippines occurred as early as 7,300 years ago. And this gives us a key split in the Austronesian language family between the Taiwanese Formosan languages and the family called Malayo-Polynesian. In these parts of the world, fishing was very important, as it was across island Southeast Asia. Since these events were occurring soon after much of Sunda sank beneath the waves, the expanding Austronesian speakers were using watercraft to travel from island to island, and these boats proved very instrumental in establishing trade networks between communities, which is why, in the archaeological record, standardization of objects like axes and pottery is so widespread here. The Philippines were completely settled by 4,000 years ago, the same time that rice and millet farming was introduced, remember. But a curious thing happened. While some groups remained rice farmers, others focused more on local plants, notably taro, yams, coconuts, and bananas, the latter of which had arrived from New Guinea a few thousand years prior. It was this package of crops, along with the pigs, chickens, and dogs that were introduced from the mainland, that formed the dietary basis of later days.
Hmm.
From the Philippines, we find successive movements across the islands of Malaysia and Indonesia, where the genetic imprint of the Austronesian expansion is widespread by 1,500 years ago. In that time, various branches of the Malayo Polynesian language family diverged into Western and Central variants. From there, some groups had ventured into the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, but we'll deal with them later. Others, much earlier in time, had hugged the Pacific Ocean and traveled to New Guinea and the other Melanesian islands. Of course, it should be noted that all of these islands had been inhabited by various peoples for many tens of thousands of years, and exchanges between genes or culture occurred in different contexts and rates. Much of the ancestry among indigenous peoples in Indonesia is Austronesian in origin, while in New Guinea, the main influence was on some of the languages along the coastlines. Evidence for admixture between Papuans and Austronesian speakers is very sparse. The peoples of New Guinea had long been farmers when these groups arrived, and we'll also discuss them in a little bit. Once along the Melanesian islands, around 3,600 years ago, we see evidence of a distinctly new cultural tradition called the Lapita. This name derives from a mishearing by archaeologists
Hmm.
that were working in New Caledonia when a local Kanak talked about a dig site, or Chapita,
Right.
which was then corrupted into Lapita. Now, the name is used in reference to the distinctive pottery, and I have a fragment of which shown below, which is stamped with very intricate designs. We find this pottery across many sites in Melanesia, from the Bismarck Archipelago to the Solomon Islands. And we know that trade was going on across the islands here, so far as specifics are concerned. We still don't know just where this cultural tradition emerged or whether it was wholly Austronesian in origin. It's very likely that the peoples of New Guinea were involved in some way. But what makes the Lapita especially important to the human story is that with them we see the invention of the outrigger boat, in which planks are attached outwards from the hull on either side, providing stability in turbulent waters. Once the sail was added, people could travel much faster over sea than ever before. And about 700 years later, we find the Lapita culture had reached the islands of Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. No human had ever set foot on these islands before, so one wonders what drove the Lapita cultures to even consider sailing here in the first place.
Hmm.
At the very least, the Austronesian speakers and their descendants had grown well versed in their knowledge of the ocean. They likely understood how currents and winds work and where they flow, and they could have used this information to plan whatever trips they took. They also certainly observed plants and animals and how they behaved near islands versus in the open ocean. Through the natural sciences, this type of long distance travel was possible. And other movements in the Pacific were facilitated by this invention too. Much of Micronesia was settled between 3.4 and 2.2 thousand years ago, sailing downwind of the summer westerlies, likely during El Nino years. But what about the rest of the islands? Well, that would have to wait. If we jump to the next slide here, before going into that part of the story, I do need to say a few words about New Guinea,
Hmm.
because this was likely the third oldest region in the world where agriculture developed. So the Austronesian expansion never really made too much of a dent here because of this long-standing farming tradition, the antecedents of which, like everywhere else, extend back very far. Recall that people were clearing some of the forests and managing the land as far back as 40,000 years ago, harvesting a number of particular foods that were well liked. Agriculture itself emerged sometime between 9 and 7,000 years ago along the highland regions, where there's evidence that communities were diverting river water towards cropland. This gradually developed as new farming practices took hold to yield more crops, including mound based cultivation 6.9 to 6.4 thousand years ago, ditch farming 4.3 thousand years ago, and large scale drainage systems after 4,000 years ago. While a few species of plants that were grown here shared ancestry with others in the island Southeast Asia, like taro, sweet potatoes, and sugarcane, other crops ultimately hailed from here, including certain breadfruits, areca nuts, sago palms, and the banana.
Hmm.
Now, the latter fruit, as I mentioned briefly before, has its own amazing history. It's also kind of an in joke, I know, among some biologists, because creationists like to use the banana as an example of intelligent design,
Right.
because it's so perfect. It's got a biodegradable outer coating. It fits perfectly in the hand. When you peel it open, it leads directly to the mouth, and all this stuff. But I mean, yeah, it was intelligently designed, but by human farmers.
Right. Right.
um, the wild species, which is known as Musa acuminata, seems to have been originally domesticated for many uses, like construction materials from fibers rather than for its fruit,
Hmm.
which, as you can see in the image here, is notoriously small and packed with seeds.
Right.
Even if the flavor is sweet, Papuan farmers took this plant and they changed it over time into a much more edible food, eventually transporting it out of New Guinea and into Southeast Asia sometime before 6,000 years ago, when its remains show up in Sri Lanka for the first time. Now, our typical supermarket bananas, of course, are a much later invention. that they've really perfected the seedless varieties of this plant, as well as through a hybridization with other types of bananas. Now, as far as domestic animals are concerned, we know that the Austronesians introduced pigs and chickens onto the island, but in all other cases, wild animals were captured and reared in captivity for food, most notably the cassowary. Now, New Guinea is well known for its agricultural communities, but a number of other societies on the island did continue to maintain their lives, mostly as foragers, usually residing in the lowland regions. Now, this has been tricky for ethnographers to describe because here, the line between forager and farmer is fairly blurred. Anthropologist Paul Roscoe in 2002 review paper mentioned that between 10 and 20 societies at the time of European contact were strictly foragers, while others relied 75 to 90% of their diet from hunting and gathering. So the influence of agriculture on the island was very grand. So, of course, neighboring forager groups would be pulled into this world. The descriptions of some of the farms by Europeans are just breathtaking to read, too, and they really tell of the extent that people shaped the land here. So let's jump to the next slide now and finish up the story of the Austronesian expansion. Uh, in fact, this story takes a serious hiatus after 900 BC. That's 2,900 years ago. Because we don't see evidence of further human settlements into the Pacific Islands until 800 AD. So that's a lag of about 1,700 years, which would put Steven Universe to shame. This length. Um, so, just what kept people from immediately going further eastward? Well, the exact causes are still being debated, but there is at least some models that go a long way towards explaining possibilities. Two of the largest concern the geography of the greater Pacific and the climate history of the Holocene. It turns out that many of the islands beyond Samoa are quite unevenly distributed, and the distance between them were typically larger than what the Lapita had to deal with previously. Also, the winds here become less and less helpful for eastward navigation and are only better to deal with during El Nino years. Now, by the onset of the medieval warm period, which also helped facilitate the movements of the Thule peoples in the Arctic, it seems that conditions changed enough that the descendants of the Lapita, so now we can talk about Polynesians proper, also speaking oceanic language families, uh, could begin to expand into the other islands. And this was helped by an increased frequency of El Nino events during the winter months. So, in other words, it was just easier to get there at a later date. So, the chronology of settlement has only improved in the last few years. We now know the expansion into Greater Polynesia began around 800 AD, and by 900 AD, much of the Society Islands, including Tahiti, were settled. From there, we have two primary bursts of seafaring that can be detected in the archaeological record of the islands. So between 1000 and 1200 AD, the Polynesians had reached the Marquesas Islands, the Austral Islands, the Cook Islands, and Hawaii. And then between 1200 and 1350 AD, Aotearoa, aka New Zealand, Chatham Island, and Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, had been reached, and the latter being, of course, the most remote island chain on Earth. Oh, excuse me, the most remote island on Earth. So much of the subsequent history on these islands is really fascinating to talk about, but given the lack of time, I'll have to save them for the next episode. Until then, two important things are need to be noted here. First off, the relative recency of Polynesian settlement is nothing short of amazing, and it's really expressed in these similarities that have been retained between islands so far apart from each other. I mean, to the point where you even have oral histories and religious figures that are shared as far apart as New Zealand and Hawaii. Secondly, despite the remarkable navigational abilities of the Polynesians, the much discussed possibility that they had managed to reach the Americas is actually based on slim to no evidence. So just to kind of go through some of the list, the chickens in South America that have been argued to hail from Polynesian chickens, which we know that they had, turn out to have actually derived from European colonists based on DNA evidence. So that's out. The sweet potato, long a staple of Polynesian and Southeast Asian diets, was once thought to have been brought westward by Polynesians visiting South America. But we now know that the domestic sweet potato descends from a species that split off from Mesoamerican ancestors over 100,000 years ago. So it must have arrived on the Pacific Islands by drifting west from the mainland.
Uh,
So that's out. Then, of course, there was that paper from last year, which argued that based on DNA studies, ancient Colombians had sailed to Rapa Nui and settled there before the Polynesians did. Yeah, that paper was very strongly criticized by a number of Pacific anthropologists, as too many things didn't add up to it.
hmm.
Um, the most parsimonious explanation is that the South American DNA tells of a much later contact during colonial times, long after island settlement by Polynesians. Of course, indigenous groups on Rapa Nui have also frustratingly mentioned that there was nothing in their oral traditions about meeting native peoples when their ancestors reached the islands. So, at present, that particular study needs to be treated with caution.
Hmm.
So, that about covers Oceania. Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
It's clearly a very fascinating chapter in human history, and I'll just say that if you've been following my bird series, we have spoken a little bit about some of the interesting species of birds that lived on these islands and would have been encountered by people for the first time during this time period.
Oh yeah, and I think just like the recency of everything too
Yeah,
just amazes me. I mean, like 1200s AD, 1300s
right,
AD, and
right.
that's well towards the end of like the medieval period when
Hmm.
like the Mongols and everything was going on, and there were still like unsettled places on Earth that people were traveling towards.
Right,
Um,
right.
it's fascinating to me. So let's jump to the next slide now. Huh? Oh, wait a minute. Did I miss something here? No, of course not. So conventionally, in these types of surveys of agriculture in world prehistory, Australia is supposed to be one of those places where farming never took off.
Hmm.
As far as the anthropological literature was concerned, Aboriginal Australians have always been nomadic foragers who had little to no impact on their environments. They owned little, carried everything on their backs, and never seemed to live in groups that were larger than 40 to 50 people. As for why this was, the usual answer is they just chose not to. Well, thanks to remarkable scholarship by a number of anthropologists and indigenous scholars, like Bruce Pascoe of Dark Emu and Bill Gamage of The Biggest Estate on Earth, these are both books, new insights coupled with rediscovery of historical records has shown that the indigenous peoples of Australia were agriculturalists
Hmm.
who dramatically managed the landscape of the continent. So, unlike the rest of this episode, there hasn't been a lot of archaeological work done on much of these observations to give us an idea of the timescales involved. But we at least have good evidence to suggest that these practices were likely occurring for many thousands of years.
Hmm.
So records of intensive cultivation have been documented from all over Australia, revealing that from outback to coast, communities utilized crops of various kinds that were artificially selected for, a hallmark of agriculture. On the map here, to the right, you'll see Norman Tyndale's delineation of the Aboriginal Grain Belt, a region of land where many nations harvested native millets and drop seed grasses, or katura, and often traded it over long distances. In some cases, millet was ground down and baked into a type of bread. The fields of grains and the built up haystacks sometimes stretched for many miles, and these harvests were stored in vessels of clay and straw. In other words, we have surplus storage. Other plants were given the agricultural treatment. Warrum yams and Murnong sweet potatoes were maintained by huge wells and ditches. Bush tomatoes, now completely dependent on human cultivation, were highly valued for ceremonies. There's a plant called nardu, which is an aquatic fern, was
Hmm.
especially helpful during the dry times. When the lakes they grew in dried up, groups would harvest the ferns en masse and then turn it into a flour for baking. So even in low rainfall areas, the collection of such diverse crops was maintained all year round. Of course, food was required in other ways. Like many indigenous communities, fire stick farming was helpful for clearing land and promoting the growth of favorable plants and animals. And they could also transport particular trees and arrange them in neat rows on the landscape. So, in several cases, this shaping of the land was so extensive that many European colonists saw it appropriate to refer to it as parkland. Now, aquaculture was very prevalent too, and we find all sorts of evidence for things like stone fish traps, which were very lucrative because the rock used for construction were set in such a way that different areas could be used at any time of water level. Now, the closest thing to domesticated animals that Aboriginal Australians had, of course, besides their dingoes,
Hmm.
were freshwater creatures like the short finned eel, the
Yeah.
tupum fish, and clams, which were farmed and bred in man made pools and dams. Now, I could go on, but I'll stop here for now. Much of the information has been thoroughly discussed by the authors I talked about before.
Hmm.
I'll be sure to link their books in the description. Um, I mean, the Aboriginal nations of Australia have no shortage of fascinating cultural traditions and subsistence practices, and the literature is rich with findings. By the time Europeans made contact in the 1600s AD, this island continent was home to at least 1 million people, speaking roughly 300 different languages and representing 500 nations. All of this is a legacy of over 50,000 years of regional continuity, with, so far as we know, little to no contact from the rest of the world. So I think it's safe to say that Australia is one cool place, eh, Albert?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump to the next slide now, and let's return to Africa,
Hmm.
where we last left the story of the continent during the humid period, when the Sahara Desert was a huge green wetland. We have good archaeological and genetic evidence that shows by 8,000 years ago, a number of domesticated plants and animals were introduced into North Africa from the Levant, including cattle, sheep, goats, barley, emmer, wheat, and flax. We know from rock art and other sites that these species were taken up by native Saharan peoples, who often used them in a pastoralist setting. And more on that later. From Arabia, between 6 and 5,000 years ago, we find evidence of gene flow into eastern Africa, which also introduced domesticated animals and plants to those local peoples, who carried them as far as the southern tip of the continent. As we can clearly see today, the Sahara is now a desert, a product of the end of the African humid period by around 5,000 years ago, when the entire region dried up severely. This acted as a pump, so it forced entire communities to migrate away from the desertified areas into more productive lands. And many of these groups moved southwards into the Sahel, which is a semi arid transitory zone between the desert and the grasslands. At the same time, groups living in the west and central tropical forests were also undergoing their own changes in response to the drier conditions, because some of the woodlands actually contracted in size during this time. So, between 4.5 and 2,000 years ago, across this wide swath of land, agriculture developed in situ, along with the incoming pastoralists from the north. Now, key areas included the West African Sahel, where pearl millet, okra, African rice, cowpeas, black eyed peas, fonio grass, and guinea millet were domesticated. Then there's the East African savannas, where sorghum and bottle gourds were domesticated. We have the Ethiopian plateau, with teff, finger millet, and Abyssinian oats and peas. And then we have the West African tropical forests, the home of oil palms, candle nuts, canarium nuts, and white yam. The only domesticated animal that we know of that is fully African in origin is the helmeted guinea fowl,
Hmm.
which lived throughout sub-Saharan African grasslands.
Yep.
So we're not too sure when and where people started breeding them. Now, other contacts have been established from surprising locations because we have definitive evidence of bananas, taro, and yams from Southeast Asian species all the way in Western African crop packages as far back as 3,000 years ago. Now, this is remarkable because this is much earlier than the Austronesian expansion into Madagascar. So we're not sure what route these crops took to get all the way here in West Africa from Southeast Asia. So, farming in sub Saharan Africa, particularly in the western forests, was often managed through a process called shifting agriculture. So that's where lands are cleared through slash and burn techniques, and then they're planted with the desired crops and then harvested after a time. And this process only works to a point, because eventually the soils become exhausted and you have to kind of pick up shop and move elsewhere to do it all over again and wait for them to replenish. Now, as wasteful as this might sound, it's really one of the best methods for growing crops in places like this. The soil is not particularly fertile for intensive farming anyway. It's full of thick clays, and so only the most productive areas were chosen for the practice, like floodplains. Now, towards the east, farming communities were highly dependent on cattle. and herding communities often supplemented their diet through the planting of their own crops or through trade from neighboring communities. But it was here where pastoralism became really important, again, as we'll see later. So let's jump to the next slide now. In much the same effect that the Austronesian speaking peoples had in Southeast Asia, so too did the Bantu speakers of West Africa.
Hmm.
Up until the advent of agriculture in the north, most of sub Saharan Africa was mostly populated by foraging peoples. You had the Central African foragers and the Khoisan speaking peoples and others who had inhabited the lands for tens of thousands of years. The Bantu language family belongs to a much larger group called Niger Congo, which, so far as we know at the moment, had an established presence among West African peoples for at least 14,000 years. We talked about Christopher Ehret last episode. He hypothesized an origin from the eastern Sahel.
Hmm.
And there was emerging ancient DNA evidence to suggest that Western Africa contained populations not related to living Niger Congo speakers today. So there's some curious history there that we're now uncovering. So this language family is further divided into a number of smaller clades, including Mande, Dogon, and the largest, which is Atlantic Congo. So Bantu is one of the families included in this latter group. Around 4,000 years ago, it emerged in the region of present day Cameroon among the farming communities of the forest margins who use pottery and polished stone tools. Since that time, and this is possibly aided by climatic changes that caused a contraction of the tropical forests to the south, the Bantu speaking farmers began to expand their ranges. And this expansion has been well traced through linguistics, archaeology, and genetic studies, which reveal the extreme closeness of cultures shared by the descendants of these travels.
Hmm.
Bantu languages remain so closely related that it's possible for people to learn several of them at once.
Hmm.
And the similarities between different Bantu speaking populations are so close that they reveal these recent origins. So, with these observations and studies, researchers have been able to trace the Bantu expansion across sub Saharan Africa. So, following the newly opened savanna corridors, Bantu speaking farmers had spread across southwestern Africa by 3,000 years ago, although some groups did appear to have traveled through the rainforests on occasion. As previously stated in episode 8, they came in contact with the Central African foragers and set in place dramatic changes to their life ways. The admixture was certainly prominent, especially from Bantu speakers to Central African foragers, and usually not the other way around. And it seems whatever language the rainforest community spoke was so heavily influenced by Bantu tongues that it's unclear just what that original language was like at
Hmm.
all. Um, of course, the greater reliance on agricultural products and in the increasing shift to sedentism was notable too. And of course, the changes in society weren't all one way. We now have good evidence to suggest that Bantu speaking peoples gained crucial adaptations to life in the more tropical regions of sub Saharan Africa. Their descendants now acquired gene variants that help their immune systems, while at the same time developing adaptations against malaria, which is prevalent in tropical regions around the world. By the time Bantu speakers reached the eastern Great Lakes region, 2,500 years ago, the Bantu language family began to split into its western and eastern subclades. Now, especially important here was the acquisition of iron working technology.
Hmm.
And we haven't talked a lot about the Iron Age on this series yet. Most of that I've been intentionally saving for the next episode.
Hmm.
But sub Saharan Africa remains a fascinating case because the peoples here did not go through a Bronze Age phase before using iron. The jump from stone to iron had no gradual transitions, and it was an independent invention, not imported from the outside by other cultures. As early as 5,000 years ago, groups in Western and Eastern Africa, and this includes the famous Nok culture of the West, mined the iron ore rich rocks, smelted them with heated charcoal, and then took the leftover bloom and forged it into the desired shape. It was originally thought that ironworking spread through sub-Saharan Africa with the Bantu expansion, but new researchers suggest that this was not fully the case. The groups who first entered Southwest Africa and crossed the Congo Basin did not use iron technology. But once they reached the Great Lakes region, they encountered Cushitic speaking peoples who did. And the merging of these cultural traditions, known as the Uru culture, marks the real start of the spread of ironworking. And then we can track its subsequent spread through the changes in pottery types that seem to have been used as furnaces. so like the piece shown here. The Bantu expansion continued to the East African coast, representing the Kwale culture of 2,000 years ago, before traveling to the southern tip of Africa by 1,500 years ago under the Matola culture. So by then, ironworking agricultural communities had now covered much of sub Saharan Africa, and most of the later Stone Age cultures of millennia past ended with the abrupt start of the Neolithic. By 1.2 thousand years ago, Bantu speakers crossed the Mozambique Channel with their cattle and they reached Madagascar. So we
Mm.
go to the next slide, we'll see that here. Now, when they arrived there, roughly 800 AD, they encountered Austronesian speakers who had arrived there 400 years prior. Based on linguistic analysis, it seems that the source for this movement of peoples was present day Borneo, from a language family called East Burrito.
Mm.
The farmers had brought with them many iconic Eurasian domesticates, including rice, taro, and mung beans, and immediately began to change the local vegetation to suit their farming needs. Although there is some controversial evidence from cut marks on animal carcasses going back as far as 5,000 years ago, a number of sites suggest that humans first set foot here only 1.6 thousand years ago via the Austronesian expansion. And of course, much could be said about Madagascar's unique plants and animals,
Mhm.
and humans encountered a number of strange extinct megafauna, including giant lemurs like Megalodapus at the bottom left here, which could grow as large as a gorilla.
Mhm.
And of course, the elephant birds like Epiornis, which Albert has discussed in his series.
Yep. Mm.
And there's also a horned crocodile called Boye,
Mhm. Mm.
which has been recently found to be a close relative of living crocodiles. Now, all these animals lived until very recently, well into historical times. And their disappearance 1.2 thousand years ago, so soon after the arrival of Austronesian and Bantu speaking peoples, strongly suggests that they played the biggest role in their extinction.
Right.
Now, in time, the admixture of both populations gave rise to the living Malagasy people, who now share much of the rich traditions stemming from both ancestries. The settlement of the northwestern Comoros is another matter of controversy.
Mm.
While recent work shows the presence of primarily Eurasian crops hailing from the Austronesian expansion, the fact that the native peoples speak Bantu languages that have mostly African ancestry makes the subject of timing difficult. So, more work needs to be done on that front to clarify who got there first
Mm.
and how much of an impact they had on the islands. And even less unclear is the early history of the other Indian Ocean islands, like the Seychelles and Mauritius, home of the dodo.
Mhm. Mm.
It can't be ruled out that African, Indian, and Austronesian island explorers and traders landed on these islands at various times.
Mm.
But the fact remains that when European colonial records begin, they clearly state that there were no humans living on the islands when they first arrived there.
Right.
So it's a bit of an open question there. So let's move on for now, and we'll wrap up Africa's agricultural history by looking at the northern regions
Mhm.
on the next
Mm.
slide. So North Africa remains a vital crossroads between Eurasian and African societies, as peoples have been moving back and forth through the Sinai Peninsula for tens of thousands of years. Nowhere is this more clearly reflected than in the genetic landscape of the region, which forms a gradient between the peoples of both continents. As we've previously seen, Levantine farmers introduced a number of plants and animals into the Sahara as far back as 8,000 years ago, when the landscape was lush and green. Both farming and pastoralism really took off, but just like in many other places around the world, communities did domesticate a few of their own crops, possibly including the always delicious watermelon. Now, it has been previously hypothesized that cattle underwent a third domestication event
Mm.
in the Sahara region that gave rise to the modern Sanga breeds, like the massive horned Watusi Anko,
Mm.
which you
Yep.
commonly see in zoos. But genetic studies have cleared the picture somewhat. Sanga cattle descend from a hybridization event between introduced Indian zebus and wild African taurines sometime around 8,000 years ago,
Mm.
which seems to confirm that, yeah, cattle were only domesticated twice. But this third group had a special origin. So we see evidence of farming communities along the Nile River between 7 and 6,000 years ago, and the emergence of both ancient Egyptian and Kushite cultures. And what makes the Nile such a great place to farm was its lush, marshy environment, which was supported by an almost clockwork yearly schedule of flooding that produced rich soil. Given that rainfall would more or less cease by the end of the African human period, this was a fortunate thing for newly emerging agricultural communities. Further to the north in the Maghreb region, the Amazigh, so descendants of the Caspian culture, had been regular farmers since at least 7,000 years ago. The genetic history of the Maghreb is particularly interesting in that it mirrors the Sinai Peninsula a bit. While the Capsian farmers of 7,000 years ago share more of their ancestry with both Levantine and sub Saharan groups, those of 5,000 years and onwards seem to show traces of admixture with Europeans from across the Straits of Gibraltar, specifically the aforementioned Cardium pottery cultures. And this movement was not wholly one way, because evidence suggests that evidence shows that we find things like ostrich eggshells and elephant ivory in the Iberian Peninsula. So trade had been established between the two communities at a very early date. Now, one neat chapter of the human story is the first settlement of the Canary Islands between 2.5 and 2.4 thousand years ago, which is probably one of the most ignored aspects of our history that I've noticed in the popular literature, and even the technical literature to an extent. The indigenous peoples of the islands are known as the Guanches, which stems from a modification of the native word for person. We actually know a fair bit about pre-European life on the islands. The Guanches raised goats and sheep, which they used for food and for clothing. They had diverse political and religious systems from island to island, and they made tools out of stone, bone, and wood. Genetic studies have basically solved their origin story. Their ancestry is shared with the Amazigh, and so this points to an expansion onto the islands after the advent of agriculture, because the crops and animals ultimately descend from mainland species. Of course, I mentioned that the Guanches are usually ignored during typical world histories, and that's frustrating to me because really the scope of the European colonization of the Americas was practiced first here by Iberians as they worked their way down the East Atlantic islands like Cape Verde. Guanches were severely impacted by this, which makes them really the first victims of the Columbian Exchange. So we really should be talking about them a lot more. Now, back on the mainland, the aridification of the Sahara 5,000 years ago ended much of the human activity that has been common along the rivers and lakes for thousands of years. But that didn't mean that humans could never live there again. Later adaptations, including the domestication of the Arabian dromedary camel, reignited travel and trade through the deserts. Of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. All right, so that's Africa's agriculture. Albert, do you have any comments?
No, not especially. Another very underappreciated chapter in human history for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump to the next slide now, and we'll go to the last part of the world that we're going to explore, the Americas. And this offers a neat look at a parallel history of agriculture to Afro-Eurasia. Save for a few crops that seem to have made the journey without human aid, the entirety of farming life here was invented and developed by Amerindians and did not influence anywhere else in the world until the Columbian Exchange. So we're going to work our way north from here in the Andes, one of the earliest regions in the Americas where farming developed. Now, the Andes Mountains are a very dynamic place. They're born from a convergent boundary between the Pacific and South American tectonic plates, which pushed up many volcanic mountains way far in the past. Today, it's the longest mountain chain on Earth and home to the tallest mountains in the Americas. And this dynamic high elevation environment, as we've seen in the last few episodes, was not a difficult barrier for human habitation. And we see settlements here soon after the peopling of the Americas. And what sets this region apart from other American agricultural centers is the fact that much of the landscape is populated by highly adapted plants and animals that were being cultivated and domesticated as early as 8,500 years ago. The most important of all of these is the potato, which is a root crop in the same family as nightshade. It grows very well here, persisting at elevations as high as 4.2 kilometers, and it can remain in soil above minus 2.7 degrees Celsius for up to a year.
Wow.
Now, Andean farmers bred many hundreds of different potato varieties, if the photo here hasn't tipped that off. And they were prepared and eaten in many different ways. They could even be frozen and used for food. Other important crops from this region include quinoa, uluku, which is another root plant, amaranth, lima beans, jack beans, and tobacco for smoking. This is where we find the earliest use of that plant here. And that last one proved very important for Amerindian societies because it spread from the Andes all the way to the southeastern United States.
Mm.
In fact, tobacco was one of the first American crops Columbus was introduced to when he reached the Bahamas. Now, the gourd is another important American plant because it could be also used for hollowing out made into like containers and bottles, for example. But its origins have been previously difficult to pin down. Amerindians have been using gourds since the earliest times, and it was hypothesized previously that they brought them to the Americas from East Asia. But genetic studies have shown that, in fact, the ancestors of American gourds come from Africa.
Hmm.
Now, this was not via a transatlantic human voyage, but rather by the plants themselves at different times floating across the Atlantic Ocean.
Hmm.
Gourds are well known for surviving ocean drifting. And this seems to have occurred within the last 60 to 103,000 years. So, domestic animals in the Americas have famously been undervalued by world historians because they don't do all the things that Eurasian animals do, like riding, plowing, and such. But even so, these animals still provided valuable resources and worked just fine for the people who raised them. In the Andes, four species were important: the llama, which is now domesticated from a extinct population of the guanaco;
Mm-hmm.
the alpaca, which is from a related camel called the vicuña;
Mm-hmm.
the guinea pig, or cavi;
Mm-hmm.
and the muscovy duck, which
Mm-hmm.
sports a fleshy face.
Yeah. Mm.
Now, llamas and alpacas, which were domesticated by 6,000 years ago, were used as a sort of meat and fertilizer for crops. But their fur in particular was especially valued. It's actually much softer and workable than sheep's wool. And llamas are very good working animals. They can lift heavy objects of a certain weight up steep surfaces, which is just what an Andean would really need. The guinea pig is an interesting case because it was domesticated first and foremost as a source of ready meat
Mm-hmm.
and not as a pet, as they are kept in places like the US and the UK. People would keep them in their homes in these little pens, and they would feed them leftover scraps from dinner. And today, this is still practiced in the Andes. My sister-in-law, in fact, got to experience this too.
Oh,
She
wow.
entered a house. They had kept them under the bed, and they would pick them up like like at a lobster tank.
Uh-huh.
Like, this one's good,
Yeah.
but this one's a little bit better.
Yeah.
And she tried it, and it was very good.
Yeah.
I have personally not had the opportunity to try guinea pig yet,
Mm.
but I would certainly do so in a heartbeat if I could. I don't know about you.
I mean, I'd be interested. Yeah.
So many meats. Now, of course, the Muscovy duck too was a meat animal, and apparently its flesh actually tastes better than mallard, which is the more common domestic duck species today. Of course, that's a Eurasian domestication event. Now, agricultural communities were widespread across the Andes by 4,000 years ago, having been supplemented by Mesoamerican crops prior to that time, and they diffused into that region between 7 and 6,000 years ago. While the highland regions consisted mostly of farming communities, those along the coastal margins, particularly present-day Peru, combined their previous maritime lifeways with the newly domesticated crops, and so a number of fascinating sedentary societies emerged. Even in regions where deserts were found, local communities made use of oases, riverways, and man-made irrigation channels to ensure their crops were watered. And really, the only major threats to farm life on the coasts were the El Nino years,
Right.
which would reduce fishing activities during certain times of years. But otherwise, the increased surplus, from farming began to support larger communities. And so by 5.2 thousand years ago, we start to see temples and pyramids common in Andean urbanization. So if we jump to the next slide here, one region of the Americas that has received very little attention, a trend here, in popular literature is Amazonia,
Yeah.
the expansive tropical forests of Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, and the other northern countries. Usually, the Amazon rainforest is treated as a natural wilderness, only sparsely populated by a number of foraging tribes who had little impact on their environment. Farming couldn't happen here because the soils were so acidic, and the forest offered little in domestic plants, or animals for that matter. And this was how it was supposed to be throughout its entire history, while the more advanced societies emerged in the Andes. But all of that cannot be further from the truth. We now know, thanks to mountains of evidence from archaeology, as well as historical sources, that pre Columbian history of Amazonia is one of a rainforest densely populated by human settlements and offering an abundance of domesticated food plants. Not only that, much of the seeming wilderness today is actually the result of agroforestry, in which farming villages actively manage the landscape through clearing and replanting of specific tree crops. And this has been going on for at least 4,500 years.
Hmm.
Further land management was occurring in the southern highlands of present day Brazil, too, as the now rare araucaria trees and their forests were being regularly managed and expanded by the Ge speaking farmers between 1.4 thousand and 900 years ago. And these insights have only been known because of the spike in archaeological activity during the late 20th century. So a
Hmm.
lot of this is like, I guess, the grand scheme of archaeology, very new research.
Right.
The peoples of Amazonia domesticated a number of important crops between 9 and 8,000 years ago, among many parts of the rainforest. The list is extensive, so just to mention a few key staples, manioc was probably one of the most important crops. Most of our viewers will know it as cassava or yucca. Amerindians domesticated many different varieties of this nutritious plant, including a bitter manioc that had to be processed to remove toxins, and a sweet manioc that only needed to be boiled. Then we have cacao, which is where we get chocolate.
Hmm.
Sweet, sweet chocolate. While this plant is usually associated with Mesoamerican societies and their chocolate drinks, which were famously not sweet like hot cocoa,
Hmm.
before sugar was added to it.
Hmm.
We now know from genetic and archaeological discoveries that cacao originated in the northwest Amazon 5.3 thousand years ago, before spreading into Mesoamerica by 3.7 thousand years ago. They also had sweet potatoes, peanuts, warty squash, arrowroot, guavas, sugar apples, ayapana, and the pineapple. And the uses of these plants extended beyond ordinary eating. We have evidence that many species were sources of fibers too, and some were even used as condiments for other foods. Now, yeah, we don't see domesticated animals here besides the dog, which had ancient origins, as we all know by now.
Hmm.
But hunting remained an important source of meat for Amazonian diets, with game animals including tapirs, deer, and capybaras. And the river systems themselves were very rich for fishing. Even manatees were being caught for food.
Hmm.
We do know as well that local crops were supplemented by introduced species from both Mesoamerica and the Andes,
Hmm.
including maize, which encouraged the development of new farming techniques that created so called dark earth, or terra preta. This is a rich soil composed of recycled materials mixed with charcoal. That was very, very good for uh, fertilizing crops. Now, the management of the rainforests by indigenous farming communities has been the most effective method keeping them alive and biodiverse. So many crops could be intensively cultivated without the need for clearing vast tracts of forest, because those forests would be replanted by fruit producing species that wild animals were used to. It's been calculated, for example, that just 6 species of tree crops growing in a standing forest provide twice as much protein as a cleared field devoted to cattle farming. And since we find evidence of these kinds of trees across Amazonia today, it ultimately means that much of the forest that we see is anthropogenic in origin.
Hmm.
Rainforest soils were usually not a big issue for growing crops either, because quite simply, the plants that were harvested by Amerindians were adapted to those same soils,
Hmm.
and their continuous management often made the soils even more productive than before. Now, these facts underscore the importance of indigenous peoples in all discussions of conservation issues,
Hmm.
including a place as rapidly deforested as the Amazon rainforest is becoming.
Hmm.
Now, another aspect of Amazonian history that is often unmentioned is the fact that this region underwent a series of very large population expansions, which are correlated with the spread of the region's most prominent language families. We know this from many sources: linguistics, genetics, archaeology, and even oral traditions. So, if we go to the next slide, we can explore some of these. The most widespread of South America's language families is Tupi Guarani, which is spoken by over 5 million people today across Brazil and Paraguay. In pre Columbian times, these peoples, consisting of the Tupinamba speakers of the north and the Guarani speakers of the south, built large agricultural villages run by powerful leaders, who often engaged in political expansion through both warfare and alliance. That these languages the people spoke were closely related was one clue that they shared a recent common ancestry, and the other was their oral history, which tells of a great journey long ago that set the ancestors of the Tupi Guarani speakers in search of the land of the grandfather, who's a celestial deity. The specific routes of this journey have long been debated, but recent genetic work has now given us a fairly good idea of the expansion.
Mhm.
And we can compare this then to the archaeological record, where the Tupi Guarani peoples have been historically linked with the polychrome pottery tradition. And there's some examples here that I show in the picture. The distinctions between the various technologies across Brazil and Paraguay are just small enough to further demonstrate their recent history as this. So the Orheimat of the Tupi-Guarani language family and its peoples has been traced to the Madeira-Guatapore region of the western Amazon, emerging sometime around 5,000 years ago. It was here that many of the hallmarks of their culture developed, including a terra preta technique for farming along river systems. Then, between 3 and 2,500 years ago, the search for the land for the grandfather began, and we then trace a linguistic split between the Tupinamba and Guarani language families. The former traveled into northeastern Brazil before hugging the Atlantic coast by 2,000 years ago, while the latter headed southeast into the Atlantic rainforests by 1,000 years ago. The Guarani expansion, in particular, was especially facilitated by climatic changes in South America, which caused the Atlantic rainforests to actually expand in size, creating the rich lands that they could farm in. Now, the lives of the Tupi Guarani speakers of Brazil, especially along the coasts, were interrupted only 500 years later when the Portuguese arrived and destroyed much of their population. So, if we jump to the next slide now, at the same time that the Tupi-Guarani expansion occurred, another ethno-linguistic group, the Arawak-speaking peoples, underwent their own population shifts.
Hmm.
This language family shares an equally widespread distribution, this time from the northwestern regions of South America. Arawak peoples are associated with both agriculture and fishing, and many of their societies were not as heavily hierarchical as their neighbors. We can trace that spread beginning 4,000 years ago in the southwest, and from there they spread rapidly across the Amazon basin, following routes along the riverways. By 3,000 years ago, they had expanded into the upper lowlands of the Orinoco, where their descendants include the Lacono nation. Now, many of these movements have been, like the Tupi-Guarani, linked with cultural changes in the archaeological record, and a range of different pottery traditions are associated with them, including the Saladoid and the Barrancoid. Now, also living primarily in the upper lowlands are the Caribbean speaking peoples, like the Kalina nations. These communities were well versed in both rainforest agriculture and fishing. In the latter case, they took those skills out to sea, and many Caribbean peoples were known for their sail powered dugout canoes. They are associated with the Arancoid pottery tradition, and their expansion wasn't as large as the Arawak speakers, but it closely linked with them once we reached further north. So, up until 2,500 years ago, the Caribbean islands were home to foraging peoples, the Casimiroid and the Otiroid cultures. But now, with the agricultural and linguistic expansions in South America, eventually the islands would be settled by new peoples. The Arawak speakers of the Saladoid tradition were first. Within a single founding event, they had entered the Lesser Antilles and boated all the way into the Greater Antilles by 1,500 years ago, eventually becoming the first humans to inhabit the Bahamas 300 years later.
Hmm.
They are known as the Lucayans, or perhaps appropriately, the people who discovered Columbus. Now, here, the distinctions in Caribbean cultures become very clear. They not only introduced agricultural practices and crops like manioc and maize, they also painted. They also had painted and incised pottery. So evidence suggests that contact with the aceramic forager populations was sparse as far as admixture is concerned, but they were almost completely displaced, save for small populations in the extreme west of Cuba, where they would become known as the mysterious Guanahatabe. Now, it's with the descendants of the Saladoid cultures that we see the various Taino nations emerge, with greater social complexity than was ever seen before
Hmm.
on the islands. Now, the second agricultural expansion into the Caribbean was a smaller and more recent affair. Caribbean speakers of the Kalinago nations traveled from the Orinoco to the Lesser Antilles only 600 years ago, and these peoples give the region its present day name, as they've been historically known as Island Caribs
Hmm.
by Spanish colonists, who corrupted the native word into cannibal. Now, this ultimately stems from a really nasty interpretation by the Spanish, because they found it easy to subjugate the Taino, while in reality the Taino had only tried to act with hospitality.
Hmm.
But they had trouble doing so with the Kalinago, who used violent resistance. So thus we see a classic dichotomy in the older literature of peaceful Arawaks and cannibalistic Caribs
Hmm.
that was used to justify colonization. But this is, of course, a huge falsehood. Um, you know, there is, some evidence for cannibalism among the Kalinago, but I mean, it's not like they made a habit of it any
Hmm.
more than any other society around the world. Um, so yeah, that about completes our coverage of South American agriculture. Albert, do you have anything to add?
No, not really. I had little, if any, idea of much of this information. I'm glad you spent this much time on it for sure.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, this is one of those things that I really had to dig for.
Hmm.
Honestly, like, a lot of like literature, primary sources, that kind of thing. That is usually paywall, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So let's jump to the next slide now, and we enter Mesoamerica,
Hmm.
which encompasses present-day Mexico and Central America. And this represents a very important stage in the history of American agriculture. Along the valleys of Oaxaca and Tehuacan, starting 8.7 thousand years ago, farming communities developed around a package of three domesticated plants. If potatoes and quinoa are the special foods of the Andes, and manioc is the special food for the Amazon, well, then maize, beans, and squash were the case for Mesoamerica. The origin of squash has already been touched on before very briefly. We have good evidence that people have been using it here in a domesticated form for 10,000 years, as well as the bottle gourd, which we're called drifted here from Africa many thousands of years prior, in a different drifting event. Maize, aka corn, came next, and its origin had previously been a tough cookie to crack. The most recent evidence points to a drawn out domestication process beginning 8,000 years ago from a wild grass called teosinte, which grew in highland regions and near streams. As you can see in the comparative photo below, teosinte looks next to nothing like modern corn,
Hmm.
and it's made many researchers skeptical of the link between the two, though now DNA research has clarified things. And it seems that the artificial selection of teosinte into maize involved a number of genetic changes that enlarged the size of the individual seeds and radically altered the inflorescence to give us the recognizable corn on the cob. It got to a point where humans were necessary for this plant to breed. Now, maize proved to be very popular, and its use can be traced through Central America and into South America by 7 to 6,000 years ago, eventually developing into thousands of different forms, as the potato had done in the Andes. Now, climbing beans of the genus Phaseolus were domesticated next, but much later still, by 3,000 years ago, and with them emerged an ingenious way of growing more crops with smaller patches of land. Because you basically let maize grow first until the stalk reaches a certain height, and then you plant the beans and the squash. Now, the beans have a vertical structure to climb on, and the leaves of the squash block sunlight at the soil and prevent weeds from sprouting. Now, this method is known as the Three Sisters and was used throughout North America wherever the three plants spread. Now, other crops that Mesoamericans bred include peppers, tomatoes, vanilla orchids, and avocados, as well as those species that were eventually introduced from Amazonia, like tobacco and manioc, chocolate. Again, the list of domestic animals is fairly small.
Hmm.
The only definitive animal besides the dog was the turkey by 2,000 years ago for its meat, eggs, feathers, and bones, which had a wide range of uses for both the mundane and the ceremonial. Other animals, of course, were farmed in various communities, but not necessarily domesticated, including macaws and green iguanas. And with the change from foraging to farming, we can very clearly see an increase in sedentary villages by 4,500 years ago, including the development of large surplus storage. And what is interesting is Like so many parts of the world, the spread of agriculture through Mesoamerica may be linked to the present distribution of an Amerindian language family called Aldo-Manguean. This language is associated with some of the earliest urban societies in the region, including that of the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs. And the glottochronological studies, so marking the changes in splits between language groups, they point to an Orheimat in roughly the same region that the oldest signs of farming occur. So there are some fair grounds for considering this. Of course, other groups like the Mayan speakers of the Yucatan had equally long histories here, and they took up agriculture by at least 3,000 years ago. And Mesoamerican agriculture also spread northward, as we'll see on the next slide. Now, the southwestern deserts and scrublands of the present day United States and Mexico have been home to Amerindian communities for tens of thousands of years. And it may be surprising to learn that this is actually a very biodiverse region.
Hmm.
The Chihuahuan Desert, for example, is more appropriately known as a grassland that supports a rich variety of cacti and other plant species. Naturally, indigenous communities in these drylands have learned much about the landscape and made use of many different resources during their time here. The Picosa and later Oshara cultures were especially long lived traditions, spanning roughly 10,000 years of hunting and gathering. One of the many early contacts between the communities of Mesoamerica and the Southwest drylands was through the introduction of desert adapted varieties of maize, beans, and squash along the Sierra Madre Mountains beginning 4,000 years ago. This was a very crucial time in the region's climate history because just 500 years earlier, the Southwest became much wetter than it presently is. You might think that this made things much easier for the native foraging communities, but in actual fact, the patterns of rainfall did not follow a predictable cycle. So there were never guarantees that a particular hunting season was going to be good. The introduction of domestic crops might have provided at least some insurance for the hard times. Eventually, by 3,000 years ago, agriculture had spread across much of the Southwest, picked up by the various Hopi, Zuni, and Tainoan speaking societies that lived there. During this time, many native species were also domesticated, including amaranth, agave, tepary beans, and pumpkins, and the turkey a second time.
Hmm.
Now, later on, still more crops entered the region by 1,500 years ago, including cotton and pigweed. And by then, southwestern peoples had developed many different irrigation techniques for growing these crops, especially as the climate changed towards drier conditions again, and their communities were living in ever larger farming villages, the predecessors of the great Puebloan cities of later years. So if we go to the next slide here, we will reach the last agricultural center of origin to emerge in the Americas, and the last one that we will cover in this episode, Eastern North America. Now, this is a relatively new understanding, having been proposed within the last few decades as an independent region known as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which is centered on the Ohio Valley. Amerindian nations of the eastern woodlands had been gradually developing societies of greater complexity and political organization, attested to by sites like Watson Brake in Louisiana, one of the oldest earth mounds in North America at 5,500 years old in its earliest stages, and the later Poverty Point culture of 3,700 years ago, which is also from Louisiana, and it's depicted here in the artwork. Now, such works were constructed by foraging peoples, but there are signs at the time that a number of communities were intensively cultivating a specific number of crops, and what ultimately led to the Eastern Agricultural Complex's emergence around 4,500 years ago. Now, here, the crops that were domesticated would never span across continents like the plants of other regions, even in the Americas, but they were important as sources of food nonetheless. The list includes some familiar and unfamiliar species. There's squash, of course, and then sunflowers, where the seeds could be turned into oils. There's pit seed goosefoot, so a quinoa-like grain. There's sumpweed, or marsh elder, which is a composite flower, kind of like dandelions and daisies. There's erect knotweed, which is a member of the buckwheat clade. And little barley, which is a relative of Southwest Asian barley. All of these plants were variously domesticated between 4,500 and 2,000 years ago, and their use helped usher in the increase in sedentary farming communities that led to the woodland period of eastern North America, around 3,000 to 2,500 years ago. We had talked a little bit about the Archaic period, which covers the time span of foraging populations after the Paleo-Indians, and this was its immediate successor. agriculture spread widely across the forests and coastal regions of the East, save for parts of Florida, where the ancestors of the Calusa constructed enormous shell mound communities, some 80 hectares across, that were supported mostly on marine and estuarine resources. Of course, there's discourse about whether they too used domesticated crops, like corn. Now, one of the cultural complexes that emerged in the Ohio Valley 2,500 years ago was the Adena. They started a grand tradition of mound building, like the earlier Poverty Point culture, where these massive earthworks were constructed as ceremonial burial sites, leading the way to the beginnings of urbanization in eastern North America. And all of this was before the Mesoamerican crops started making their way into the region, only by 1.2 thousand years ago. Now, two important developments mark the Eastern Woodland period. First is the beginnings of settled life on the Great Plains. And this region had been one of the most sparsely populated areas of the early Americas, only peopled by nomadic groups that followed the seasonal bison herds on foot.
Hmm.
They continued to use the atlatl, or the spear thrower of their Paleo Indian ancestors, and would run their herds off cliffs where gravity would help take care of things.
Hmm.
We know quite a number of these sites, including the humorously named Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, which is found in Alberta, Canada. Now, the Great Plains really wasn't the type of place that could support sedentary societies, but with the advent of agriculture, farmers began to establish settlements along the Missouri and Platte rivers. Thus began the Plains woodland period, around 2.2 thousand years ago. And the people who started settling the plains, the Siouan and Caddoan speakers, were the ancestors of nations like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Pawnee. And a lot of what we know about them comes from European colonists who documented the lives of the Great Plains River communities, including their big Earth Lodge villages, and the fact that they used the dog as a draft animal.
Hmm.
They would they would carry their gear for them. The second important developments concern demographic shifts in the East. Around 2,000 years ago, Algonquin speaking people started expanding into the eastern seaboard from eastern Canada, where they would take up agriculture and set up large village communities, including Sinacamaca, which is the famous Powhatan Confederacy that the Jamestown settlers met in 1607. Now, this spread of Algonquin speakers likely introduced the bow and arrow to much of eastern woodlands, and where it had a dramatic effect on both hunting and warfare. At the opposite end of things, sometime prior to 3,500 years ago, Iroquoian speakers started expanding northward. They've been hypothesized to have originally inhabited the Appalachian Mountains before some groups moved into the Great Lakes region, where their descendants would found the Haudenosaunee, or the League of the Iroquois, around 1142 AD,
Hmm.
with a democratic government that played a role in shaping the young United States. Now, those that stayed in the Appalachians, of course, include the ancestors of the Cherokee and Tuscarora nations. So, with that, we conclude coverage of North American agriculture. Albert, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so.
Alrighty then. So let's jump to the next slide here. Uh, any history of agriculture would be incomplete without at least including the peoples who picked up farming practices but did not become or remain sedentary farmers.
Hmm.
These are the pastoralists,
Hmm.
nomads in the sense completely different from nomadic foragers. Rather than settle in one place and grow crops, pastoralists herd livestock across vast areas of land and support their animals not by surplus stocks of domestic grains, but by simply letting them feed on the available plants that grow within those places. Now, given the types of animals that pastoralists keep cattle, sheep, goats, horses, reindeer what you usually find is that these types of herding cultures usually inhabit grassland environments, where the soil is not very friendly towards tilling. So farmers tend not to build their settlements in places like this, and that gives their pastoralist neighbors the room they need for their own livelihoods.
Hmm.
Now, the world of pastoralism is not really one marked by hunting and gathering like it is for nomadic foragers. Most of the nutrition used by them comes exclusively from their livestock, including meat, milk, and even blood, which has a surprisingly good source of vitamin C
Hmm.
that is easy to acquire without slaughtering an animal for it. I mean, you'll have some communities puncture a vein on their cows and treat it like a tap, and then
Hmm.
they take the blood that they need and
Right.
then let it heal for the next time. So it's quick and easy. Another opportunity for food is from the stomachs of killed livestock, too, where the partially digested grasses can actually be consumed.
Hmm.
But it's not just food. So many other resources come from herd animals, especially skins, hides, and furs, which are turned into clothing or building materials for temporary dwellings during camp nights. Still, a diet of only animal meat and drink is not enough to sustain a pastoralist community, and there were times when contact with agricultural peoples is necessary to acquire goods through mutual trading. So you give me some fruits and vegetables to eat, and in return, I'll give you these skins and furs.
Mm-hmm.
Or they'll just steal it through wartime raiding. One of those time honored traditions you always see in world histories is conflict between agriculturalists and pastoralists.
Mm-hmm.
And many societies around the world have been shaped by these successive wars. For example, one of the many factors that went into the gradual construction of the Great Wall of China was to keep out warring pastoralists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with all this in mind, you have to wonder just how and why pastoralism emerged in the first place. And needless to say, that's still a large area of debate. It's likely the origins of nomadic herding varied from place to place as it did for farming. Some groups may have originally came from settled farming communities, but then chose to reject sedentism and took to the grasslands. Others may have been foragers initially, but adopted some domestic animals into their otherwise nomadic lives. This may have been especially true in the more northern regions of Eurasia, where the taiga wasn't, really good farming country anyway, but it was good for supporting reindeer herding. And as we'll see on the next slide, pastoralism was widespread.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Uh, yeah, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but it does demonstrate the scale and spread of pastoralism in human history. But the fact that nomadic groups expanded so far is simply a side effect of their lives. If you're going to be a pastoralist, you're going to be moving around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's good grazing land, you'll want to take your livestock there to support them. It just so happens that, as with agricultural societies, pastoralism is associated with a number of the world's great linguistic diasporas. We're going to talk about the Yamnaya culture and the spread of Indo European languages in the next episode, but I just want to briefly mention all of these. So, the presence of Uralic speaking nomads in Northeast Eurasia by 5,000 years ago was the result of admixture between nomadic Neo Siberians and Mesolithic European foragers. These groups based their lives around reindeer herding, and they had managed to reach the Baltic region by 2,500 years ago, where their descendants include the Sami and the Finnic speaking peoples. To the east of Siberia, we find the Turkic Mongolic speaking peoples, who we talked about previously. They share ancestry with millet farming agriculturalists from East Asia, as well as with Neo Siberians. Groups started forming nomadic confederations around 3,500 years ago, and the rest would be very familiar history to a lot of our viewers.
Mm-hmm.
The Xiongnu that warred with the Han Dynasty, the Huns who penetrated Europe during the end of the end of the Roman Empire, the Gok Turks, and the Mongol Empire that ruled much of Central Asia during medieval times. And the latter is especially important. That was, to date, the largest land based empire in human history. So, moving down into Southwest Asia, we find the Semitic speaking peoples, descendants of the original Levantine agriculturalists. Linguistic studies trace the origins of this language family to 5.7 thousand years ago, from which some groups turned to nomadism and expanded across the Arabian Peninsula, eventually reaching the Horn of Africa by 2.8 thousand years ago. Of course, the Semitic language family includes Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, and it was the people who spoke these languages that would provide one of the biggest contributions towards the modern world, because they founded Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Africa, pastoralism was just as widespread as it was in Eurasia. Some of the Amazigh that farmed in the Maghreb turned to nomadism, and they established themselves in the Sahara Desert as the Tuareg by 1.7 and 1,500 years ago. They played a strong role in trans-Saharan trade between northern and southern Africa, where they were sometimes known as the Blue People because of the indigo that they dyed their clothing with. In the introduction of cattle and sheep from Southwest Asia into Eastern Africa, kickstarted a series of pastoralist expansions, most notably that of the Nilo-Saharan speaking peoples, who may have been among the groups that roamed the Green Sahara and were pushed southwards following desertification that followed. They began to expanding south into the African Great Lakes region around 3,000 years ago, and have continuously done so ever since. The Maasai, for example, entered present-day Kenya and Tanzania by the 1750s. Another East African group speaking the Southern Cushitic languages of the Afro-Asiatic family
make their mark in the archaeological record under the savanna pastoral Neolithic culture of 4,500 years ago. The presence of these nomadic communities played a great role in shaping Eastern African savannas over the past 3,000 years, because the penning and herding of their cattle meant that lots of nutrient poor soils were fertilized by manure and thus became much more productive for grazing wildlife. So it seems that much of the diversity and longevity of East Africa's savannas prior to European colonization was created as well through anthropogenic factors.
Hmm.
Now, the Kwekwe, for Khoisan speaking peoples like the Kalahari Bushmen or San, are herders of sheep, goats, and cattle, and they range across much of southern Africa, especially in the east. And they began their pastoralist practices around 2,000 years ago. Genetic studies actually seem to indicate that it was more than just livestock that entered their lives. Um, the Kwekwe today share ancestry with both Eastern African farmers and Southwest Asian farmers, tracing back as far as 5,000 years ago. And it just kind of goes to show how far a pastoralist life can take you. Now, as important as cattle, sheep, goats, and other domestic animals are in the story of farming and pastoralism, there is one animal that holds a very special place, and that is the horse.
Hmm.
So, to the next slide now. Equus ferus is the scientific name for our domesticated horse, and the origin of this species has been a matter of discussion for some time. Its early history is fairly well known. The horse lineage Equidae evolved in North America and spent most of its time there until the opening of the Isthmus of Panama and Beringia at the end of the last ice age, which allowed these hoofed animals to spread around the world.
Hmm.
By the end of the Younger Dryas, the horse had gone extinct in the Americas, only surviving through the populations that reached Eurasia and Africa, giving rise to the modern horses, asses, and zebras. And it's at this point that we reach discourse. So the oldest human culture to have used horses are the Botai pastoralists of present-day Kazakhstan, around 5,500 years ago, who are distant descendants of the ancient North Eurasians. The horse was ridden for transport, and we find evidence of bit wear in Botai horse teeth remains, and it provided food in the form of meat and milk. It has been previously unclear as to what context the horse was first domesticated in, but recent work suggests that the Botai were steppe hunter gatherers who had originally hunted horses before they started managing wild herds and later penning them for breeding, similar to how the reindeer was domesticated by the Uralic speaking peoples in the far north. We've even been able to discover some aspects of early horse domestication through ancient DNA studies. We know, for example, that genetic changes associated with domestication in horses include selection towards stronger and faster limbs, and changes in physiology associated with greater energy demands, which suggests that there was a greater reliance on travel and transport in the early days of horse domestication. And of course, we also find changes in brain development associated with increased sociability, higher learning, and overall friendliness. Again, common in domesticated animals. Now, as far as population history is concerned, this too is being better understood thanks to new research. And of course, if by better understood, I mean more complicated. It turns out that many different species of wild horses used to span a wide range across Eurasia since the last glacial period, from the Iberian Peninsula to Siberia, and that all of these animals have died out in the last few thousand years. Even Przewalski's horses, which were once thought to have been the last surviving wild population, have been found to actually be descendants of domesticated Botai horses who went feral. And so all of our modern horse breeds, it turns out, are not related to the Botai horses, but come from a separate population of wild horses.
Hmm.
The question is, which one? And that's very hard to say. The DNA from wild horses in Iberia and Siberia, at least, shows little to no contribution towards modern horse ancestry, so they're likely not the founding lineages. More research will be needed to sort this out, but whatever the horse's ancestry, these animals would continue to increase their importance
Hmm.
among other Central Eurasian pastoralist groups, and they would be traded from group to group and increase their spread across the steppes. Now, the subsequent use of horses, alongside the invention of the chariot 4,000 years ago, would lead to dramatic changes in human history across Eurasia, Africa, and eventually the Americas, as travel, trading, and warfare were amplified and expanded into places never before reached by our species. And of course, the presence of between 200 and 400 different horse breeds, depending on who you ask, is a testament to how much we've come to cherish these animals.
Mm.
What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an adorable photo you picked for this slide.
Yeah, that's from my friend Chris.
Right, yeah.
Um, their farm has a couple of horses. And I guess just to get this out of the way too, ponies are not baby horses.
Right, right.
They are just adult horses that are bred to be small.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important distinction there. I didn't learn that until very late in life. I'm ashamed to say. But alrighty then, let's complete this episode now by going to the next slide and address the proboscidean in the room. Many scholars of various fields, and not just anthropology, have argued at various times that agriculture was either the greatest of human achievements that has made life much more bearable for all of us, or the single worst mistake we ever made, leaving us with a poorer world than we started with. Now, I have no doubt that these arguments are mostly subjective. I mean, instead of objectivity in anthropological matters is even feasible a lot of the time.
Right, right.
We're not ready for that conversation. Right away, I need to emphasize that the start of agriculture really was an important aspect of human history. Why do you think I dedicated the whole episode of this series to it?
Yep.
I mean, the changes it caused are still felt very strongly today. But important doesn't equal better. In anthropology, it's not helpful to think in terms of better. I think this is true for many of the natural sciences. I mean, mammals were an important part of the evolutionary history of the Cenozoic, but that doesn't mean that they were better than the other animals that lived during that time. So I think calling agriculture the greatest of human achievements is already suspect. So let's go through some of the arguments that have been put forward to say that agriculture was a mistake. And there have been many of them. But they more or less can be brought down into four main points. The first one here, farming dramatically changed the natural world into an impoverished place. Forests have been cleared, fields overgrazed, soils wasted. Now, the observations behind this argument are fairly well known to ecologists. The presence of monocultures today, so these are croplands that are dominated by just one kind of plant, are notoriously devoid of biodiversity. The soils of monocultural fields become poor, eventually leading to the disappearance of the topsoil itself. The pesticides and fertilizers used to maintain these crops harms wildlife, and in essence, they're more at risk from disease and other disasters. I mean, you don't need to look no further than the oil palm plantations of Southeast Asia and South America, and how millions of hectares of rainforest have been destroyed to provide space for just one kind of plant. And let's not forget the effects of overgrazing by livestock. The negative effects of this type of agriculture are obvious, certainly, but consider this question. Is agriculture an inherently destructive process to the environment? Or is it all based on the type of agriculture that's done? As a reminder, humans have been altering the so-called natural world since the start of the Holocene epoch, if not longer than that. Hunting and gathering peoples often included the use of fire for clearing fields and forests, or the intensive cultivation of certain crop species in wild gardens. Nomadic and sedentary forestry societies have been altering the landscape for a lot longer than agricultural societies have, and in many cases they have done so carefully and responsibly, so as not to cause ecological damage. Remember, we're megafauna. These types of things are just what we do.
Yeah.
All of the earliest agriculture started out this way, as an extension of foraging. And multiple times in this episode, we've seen that even as farming communities dramatically change the landscape, they still manage not only to maintain biodiversity, but encourage it. The Aboriginal Australian farmers would shape their crop fields in such a way that ensured wild herbivores like kangaroos could pass through and eat their favored plants without disturbing the cultivated ones. Over 4,500 years, the Amazon rainforest was transformed through agroforestry, which utilized crops from multiple varieties, which sustained millions of people while allowing millions upon millions of animal and plant species to continue flourishing. East Africa's pastoralists actually made the savannas a much more fertile place with their cattle herds. And we see similar trends across other regions of the world. In Europe, the arrival of farming communities did not immediately bring widespread deforestation. Much of it retained forest cover well into the Iron Age. But wait a minute. Don't we have examples of large-scale societies that collapsed due to agriculture?
Hmm.
There certainly have been plenty of examples discussed in the academic and popular literature. The classic Maya, the Rapa Nui, the Nazca culture of Peru, etc. And these societies are admittedly outside the scope of this episode, but to be brief, there has been a lot of discourse about the so called collapse of these cultures, and there isn't a consensus that agriculture was solely to blame.
Hmm.
Many researchers have pointed out that the seeds of collapse were often more socio political than agricultural, the result of poor judgment and planning on the parts of leaders. The lessons here aren't agriculture is destructive, they're in fact agriculture, when done irresponsibly, is destructive. Because it puts people at increased risk of things like sudden climatic swings.
Hmm.
Agriculture is put through extreme intensification without a proper understanding of the environment and how it works, then it becomes harder to mitigate or adapt to dramatic changes. And then most everyone loses. So I think the argument that agriculture is bad because it inherently harms the environment is flawed. So this next one states human workload increased dramatically, leading to social stratification, war, and the idea of property. Well, this one is easy to debunk. We've already talked a little bit about this during our discussion of nomadic foragers in episode 8. The workload of a hunter gatherer tends to be fairly hard too, especially when you factor in things like processing food. With that in mind, the average work week for a forager is 70 hours, far longer than people in the United States have to work. And when you consider the workload of a farmer, anywhere from tilling soil and planting crops to the harvest and its preparation, that also tends to average less than a forager. Now, the entire idea behind this argument is based on an old hypothesis that it was the start of farming that caused foragers to start becoming sedentary. But we know, from that sedentism emerged far earlier in human history than this, deep into the last glacial period. And sure, the signs of, social stratification, warfare, and private property do seem to increase during the rise of agriculture around the world, but that's not to say that these things didn't exist in forager societies. You recall that the Pacific Northwest nations developed a sedentary society with wealthy leaders, slavery, and divisions of labor without harvesting a single domesticated crop. So, moving on to argument number 3, agriculture reduced the human diet to a few staple crops and has harmed our health. Well, here's where we start to get into interesting territory. It has been traditionally understood that forager societies tend to have much more varied diet than farming societies. People go out and catch whatever animals and plants are known to be edible and bring them home, while farmers dedicate their entire lives to what they grow and breed on their lands. This is so oversimplified that it's actually really wrong.
Hmm.
In many cases, foragers choose to be picky, so that even if there's food in their environment that is overabundant, they won't necessarily collect it. Some forager communities reserve certain foods for times of stress, while others like to intensively collect only a few plant and animal foods. At the opposite end of things, farming societies do often supplement their harvests with wild caught foods, and not just during stressful times when crops are producing low yields. In fact, in some cases like among some groups in New Guinea, it's more accurate to call them part-time farmers. So it's a misleading dichotomy when you're thinking about diet.
Hmm.
In any case, researchers have pointed to a number of changes in human skeletal remains that they have linked to the shifts from foraging to farming. One example is cavities. For years, it's been argued that the shift from a diverse diet to mostly starches brought about the first known cases of tooth decay in farming populations. But we now have evidence for cavities among the Ibero-Mauritanians of the Maghreb, who were foragers that turned to the intensive cultivation of wild plants that were just very starchy. And the same goes for the Natufians, who were not farmers either, remember. And among living forager populations, as documented by ethnographies, we also find the presence of cavities, often at higher rates than neighboring farming communities. So this link is not so clear cut. Similarly, scholars have argued that the shrinking of the diet actually caused farming populations to reduce in height as their bodies succumb to various deficiencies and disorders. And this is true. Across various agricultural societies in Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean, we see the average height diminished by a few inches as people shifted from foraging to farming. But when you continue looking forwards in time, you find that everybody's height reaches previous forager levels again. So what happened here? Well, it's very simple. People evolved in response to the various health issues caused by or enhanced by farming. In one worldwide study by anthropologist Timothy Gage, he discovered that, contrary to popular understanding, mortality rates did not increase with the rise of agriculture, meaning that the average lifespan did not become shorter. And this tells us that whatever health risks came with farming, we powered through it. And in time, our bodies evolved to better handle the foods we were eating and drinking in increasing amounts. So, the continued use of milk from domesticated cattle among many societies in Africa, Southwest Asia, and Europe eventually led to those human populations developing lactase persistence beyond childhood. The increased reliance on starchy foods like rice led to greater copies of the amylase gene in successive generations, allowing them to better digest these grain crops, and so on. And these are all examples of human physical evolution within the last few thousand years. And so this last argument here is closely tied to the previous one. So many deadly diseases have emerged with the rise of agriculture, and pandemics are the result. And this is generally true, but not entirely so. This goes back to a very classic observation in human prehistory. As sedentary human societies began farming, they came in much closer contact with domesticated animals. Often this meant sharing the same living spaces with them, and this increased sharing of space led to the rise and spread of various zoonotic diseases, which transfer from animals to humans, or vice versa. Many of the most vicious diseases humans have faced have been linked to the rise of agriculture. Tuberculosis, syphilis, measles, smallpox, influenza, diphtheria, and more. In many cases, direct links have been made between pathogens and the animals they derived from, and we have a good understanding of the ways in which it happened. In fact, one way in which some human STIs emerged is quite shocking. Yeah, dare I say it, there were cases in early agricultural times when farmers decided it was a good idea to have sex with their livestock. The fact that the book of Leviticus has to make a point about it should be a clue to this. But as more research has gone on, it turns out that many of these diseases that I've just named, so often linked to the birth of farming, actually have pre-agricultural origins. Tuberculosis, for example, which originated in cattle, emerged long before the domestication of cows. And it actually seems to have jumped to humans in Africa during our Middle Pleistocene origins and traveled with us as we expanded into Eurasia. And the origins of other diseases like syphilis and influenza are even less well known. And until more research is conducted, it's very likely that we'll discover that many diseases transferred to humans, prior to the start of farming. And even so, agricultural spaces are well known for encouraging the spread of diseases. That can't be denied. And in recent times, this has not ceased. Of course, who could forget the bird flu that arose from domestic fowl, or the swine flu, which is self-explanatory. The presence of animal markets only adds another layer to this. And there has been some research that does point to illnesses like COVID-19 stemming from places like that, where millions of animals are kept confined in dirty cages and are constantly touched by human hands, thus increasing the risk of spread of disease. Now, of course, today, many of the ancient diseases have been thoroughly dealt with, with the rise of medical technology, as well as human adaptation. Smallpox, for example, was famously announced to have been completely eradicated from the world stage in 1980, which is a wonderful example of human ingenuity. So in the end, what is the verdict? Was agriculture a blessing or a curse to humanity? Well, in my opinion, based on all the evidence that we've just looked at, I would say neither. I mean, because agriculture did not emerge as a single invention.
Right.
It is the result of a long history of continuous human management of natural environments. It's very hard to put a marker on the timeline of human history and say, this is when things messed up. In general, many human societies have managed to maintain a healthy lifestyle and an ecologically diverse home through responsible agricultural practices. And this must be kept in mind when we decry the negative outcomes of farming. Those concerns are still valid for the most part, but we have to remember that farming today is not the same as farming in the early Neolithic. A lot has changed.
Right.
When you look at the monocultures or overgrazing livestock, are we decrying agriculture itself or the people who made the decisions to farm in this way? Yeah, we faced many of the problems of agriculture head on and adapted to them. And as long as we're able, we will continue to do so. And that is certainly especially needed today.
Yep.
What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable conclusion to draw. And in fact, I was just thinking that too. Um, what you mentioned about how a lot of these negative effects more relate to a specific type of agriculture being practiced and not so much agriculture inherently. That's definitely something we need to keep in mind now in a time of global change and the necessity of adaptation. Um, yeah, this is a very salient conversation to have in these times, and I'm sure you'll probably cover this more in a future episode.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Um, yeah, it's definitely very important. Um, and of course, there is one side effect of agriculture that is important to remember. If we jump to the next slide, um, with agriculture, pastoralism, and their spread around the world, the number of communities who practiced foraging, if
Mm,
that be nomadic or sedentary, started to decline.
mm,
This map represents the state of the foraging world at the end of the post classical age, right as the Columbian Exchange was beginning. Uh, by then, farming and nomadic herding had encompassed much of the world's subsistence practices. Most of Eurasia and Africa was owned by agricultural societies, and the Americas were especially impacted. Now, of course, every group represented on this map wasn't strictly a forager. The point is about the practice of hunting and gathering as a main source of sustenance. Some of these communities descend from farming communities. The Ache, for example, are Guarani speakers who were originally tropical rainforest farmers. And the presence of foraging Maori groups in southern New Zealand is notable because the Polynesians who first landed there were agriculturalists.
mm,
Many others, of course, coexisted with farming peoples for thousands of years, like the Central African foragers or the Guanahatabey of western Cuba. And some felt little to no impact from their farming neighbors, while others were severely affected to the point where they had no choice but to take part in farming practices. And this all goes back to the first question we asked on this episode. Why did farming begin? With answers now in the back of our heads, we can turn around and ask, why did some people not become farmers?
mm, mm,
Like the former question, the reasons tend to be varied. Some parts of the world were already so rich in natural resources that the selection pressures that turned intensive cultivation into agriculture just weren't there. For the Thule peoples of the North American Arctic or the Paleo-Siberians of eastern Siberia, this was especially clear.
mm,
As tough as the polar regions are, the people have survived there just fine through their increased understanding of the environment. Look what happened to the Norse.
mm,
Um, they may have been familiar with farming peoples who lived further south, but just chose not to take up the practice, already aware that this lifestyle wouldn't help them survive any better than they already were. And at the end of the day, since we know that agriculture only emerged out of a long-standing tradition of land management, perhaps this answer is enough. Some people didn't become farmers because they just didn't. You know, but the last practicing foragers were not stagnated by this in any way. Remember, every human society on Earth today has been constantly changing since their inception, sharing the same amounts of time as everyone else. People don't live in a vacuum. They are frequently meeting, collaborating, and fighting with each other. And this has shaped subsequent human history. This means that hunter gatherers are not less advanced than farmers or pastoralists because agriculture isn't a predetermined stage in some path of human evolution.
mm, mm,
The conditions that led to farming were complex, arriving at particular places at particular times, and it was never guaranteed that it would happen at all.
mm,
And this has been true for every part of the human story we've just explored, from stone tool use to aesthetic imagery to the invention of watercraft. The emergence of agriculture was important, but not because it was necessary for the evolution of humanity. It was important because of what it did for human
mm,
evolution.
mm.
And with that, I conclude this episode. Um, Albert, do you have any closing thoughts?
I think it is striking, just going region by region and looking at how agriculture was taken up independently. How much of the resources we commonly use today originated in very disparate regions of the world. Like I can go to the supermarket and obtain easily, crops or animal products that originate from like essentially every continent on Earth. and probably commonly do so. Um, we truly live in a global society, and I think it is interesting to see how all these different origins of agriculture contributed to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and yeah, I think it's definitely something that I always keep in mind too when I go to the supermarket. Of course, with this knowledge in mind, you know, I I always look at foods differently than if I didn't know this kind of stuff. I
Right.
mean, my dinner plate could easily have samples from every single, domestication center, throughout human history
Right.
on just one plate. If that doesn't, symbolize globalization, I don't know what could really. Um, so it's just remarkable to me. So let's see if we go to the next slide. Yeah, our next episode will effectively wrap up the prologue part of this series because we're going to follow the human story up to the start of urbanization and the state. Humans have lived in all sorts of dwellings around the world, including caves and valleys, nomadic bands, and farming villages. But as agriculture intensified and more people began to live in closer proximity, their ways of life started to change in increasingly complex ways, whether that be the development of bronze and iron metallurgy, or the formation of writing, or the emergence of big gods. These final catalysts would kickstart the history of nations we are all familiar with today. And so, all that and more next time. Of course, I'd like to thank our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to this series. And if you'd like to follow us on Twitter for updates, we are at Time and Clades. Of course, you are most likely watching us on our YouTube page through Time and Clades. We encourage you to subscribe and leave any comments if you're interested in what we've had to say. Any questions, compliments, concerns. You can email us as well at timeandclades@gmail.com. And of course, we will put in the description the links to the references for this episode. Of course, again, there are quite a few of them, as well as any aforementioned things we mentioned in this series. And so, with next week, I believe we're going to go to your series next, right, Al?
Yeah, we're gonna get back to some birds. Yeah, so the particular group of birds we're going to be looking at is a group called Picocoraceae, and that's not a household name, but you've probably heard of many of these birds. They include things like the kingfishers and woodpeckers and toucans and many others too. And some of them are probably among the most unusual birds I can think of in terms of how weird their adaptations get. So I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Oh, excellent. Some of my favorite birds, too, in that
Mhm.
group as well. Oh, great. Well, we're looking forward to it. But until then, thank you all so much for coming and hanging out with us. I know this was certainly another lengthy episode, but we know how much you guys like our long form content, so we're glad you stay with us till the end. And we will see you all next time.
See ya. Take care.